The Tetractus, or high Methesis with her charm severe, of line and number was our theme, and we sought to behold her unborn progeny. And thrones reserved in truth's celestial sphere, while views before attained became more clear. And how the one of time, of space the three, might in the chain of symbol girdled be. And when my eager and reverted ear caught some faint echoes of an ancient strain, some shadowy outlines of old thoughts sublime, gently he smiled to see revived again, in later age and occidental clime, a dimly traced Pythagorean lore, a westward floating mystic dream of four. Hello, and thank you for listening to Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
I'm Cody.
I am Will.
I'm Luke.
And this week we are going to be discussing chapters 38 and 39 of Against the Day, which, while only being 30 pages, could represent a week's worth of work for you. So I have nothing but pleasure that I'm able to shorten that experience for you all if you're trying to read this book in the way that Pynchon is intending to, by presenting something much shorter. Luke, do you have a summary prepared for us?
I do. Chapter 38. We open with Kit arriving in Ostend. Almost immediately, Kit falls in with a fellow group of mathematicians. There's a quaternion convention in town. He finds a place to stay with one of the conventioneers and soon meets a nihilist terrorist cell that calls themselves Young Congo. Young Congo recently joined forces with a pair of Italians, Rocco and Pino, who stole secret plans for a manned torpedo they plan on using to assassinate King Leopold. Kit socializes with the quaternion crowd and the anarchists, and eventually meets Umeki, a fellow mathematician. Their pairing is quite short-lived, however. We get a short and not too shabby song, then Root and Kit reconnect. They go to a casino where Kit meets another beautiful woman, Pleiade. Root and Kit help her win a boatload of money, then they abscond to the casino's restaurant where they go all out. Next, Pleiade has a rendezvous with her lover, Piet. We get some backstory on Piet, then a discussion between Piet and his handler, Decker. The next day, Kit accompanies Pleiade to her room where she abandons him. He makes his way back to his hotel where he discovers that someone has gone through his belongings. Kit and Pleiade see each other at a restaurant in Ostend, then go to a bar where they, of course, discuss mayonnaise and sauces in general. Pleiade invites Kit to the mayonnaise works. Though Kit definitely knows better, he decides to go. Once he arrives, he is immediately drowning in mayonnaise. It was a setup all along. Kit somehow escapes the mayonnaise works with the help of Rocco and Pino and their manned torpedo. Chapter 39. We rejoin the Chums of Chance as they arrive in Ostend for a funeral. They recognize many of the quaternionists from their time at Candlebrow University. We find out that Miles has been deeply engaged in a project of the spirit ever since their time in Inner Asia. This project gets in the way of his work and seems to utterly consume him. Miles and Chick discuss the fact that Miles has recently seen one of the trespassers, Ryder Thorne. Him and Thorne have plans to meet up again. So, on a bright day, they do meet up. They go for a bike ride through the Belgian countryside. The pair discuss the future and Miles's special powers. Thorn gets increasingly angry as Miles remains detached from the horrific future Thorn is sure will soon arrive. Then Miles discovers that Thorn is not really corporeal, and then we go back to the frame story. Miles and Chick's discussion of Miles' encounter with Ryder Thorn. Miles and Chick are talking about their fellow chums and how frail they are when the chapter ends.
So just to start, what do we think of chapters 38 and 39?
I love this book so much. And it's because of chapters like these. It was genuinely like, it's such a pleasure reading a book that you're familiar with for the second, third, fourth, whatever number of times it is. But to come across like scenes that you've been kind of anticipating or moments that you've been anticipating and you finally get there and it's still as good as you remember it, maybe even a little bit better. It just makes it so much more rewarding. And I find myself reading this and thinking like, well, try as I might, I will never be this good of a writer. And that's okay. I just have to come to the realization that that's just the way life is. That I'm just thankful that this book exists. It's phenomenal. It's beautiful. These are some of my favorite chapters in the entire book. I think I think in every Pinchon novel, I think there's one sort of scene that is I guess in a way it's kind of like the pinnacle of his humor. It's a longer drawn out scene of that humor, but it works so well that I'm crying reading it. In Mason and Dixon, obviously, it's the mechanical duck. In this, it's the mayonnaise factory.
The mayonnaise works.
It's so stupid, so good, and so well written, and set up so well. I can't help but just like read it in awe and think like, this is amazing. Like it's so, and everything around it too. I'm not trying to diminish everything else around it. It's a fantastic set of chapters, but that like I've been waiting to have a discussion about that particular scene. And then so much more in here. Like there's so much, like a lot of the Quaternion stuff, the thematics of that starts to come up a lot more in here. You start getting like Kit as a character. There's a lot of development into who he is and how he's moving through the story. The second of these chapters, 39, like as far as scenes with the chums, might be my favorite. It's a bleak portrayal of where they are at this point in the story. And I'm particularly Miles's part within there is just fascinating, and it really starting to tighten the sort of loop of his character arc and everything. But my God, what a set of chapters!
The line "Meet me tomorrow night out in the mayonnaise" works.
No, you have to whisper it like intently, like it's
sorry. Let me get real close to my microphone.
Yeah.
Meet me tomorrow night out in the mayonnaise works. That line, it feels like it was cut directly from the Grand Budapest Hotel.
Yeah.
in a way that is impossible given that it prefigures the Grand Budapest Hotel by a number of years. But just like that line and the fixation on this weird mayonnaise factory in general is certainly a contender for one of the most pinch-on parts of this book, I would say, in terms of his humor. Was lightning destroying failed mayonnaise? Was that in this book a really long time ago?
Dixon.
Or okay, I was gonna say, or was it Mason and Dixon?
I want to say it comes up in here too, but yeah, he's got a mayonnaise
fixation with mayonnaise. Mayonnaise that has failed is a distinctly Pinchonian thing. But no, I would agree that like this set of chapters, especially the first chapter, represents the turning point where we've passed halfway through the book. And I would say that certainly this chapter 38 does feel almost sort of like crossing the Rubicon in the terms of like a lot of details from the first half of the book come back around, in some cases for the first time, in some cases for the second or third time in this chapter, in a way that really feels like, okay, if you've made it here, then like there's kind of no going back. Like you're gonna continue on through the end of the book almost, because you're beginning to see how these things are fitting together in like a broader scheme, which is really impressive given how disparate a lot of it feels at times. And I, in being the show's, I guess, primary researcher is a way that I have referred to myself at times for the historical stuff with Against the Day specifically. I have noticed that, like, oftentimes there is almost an impish quality to the amount of work that Thomas Pynchon makes you do in this book specifically. I can't say that I've noted this in the research I've had to do for other ones because they're less encyclopedic. Where, like, it is absolutely a hilarious joke in terms of this like meta relationship between the author and the reader, that he would give you one of the longest chapters so far in the book filled with all of this dense information that you have to, like, there are times where you're going to be stuck researching stuff on the same page for hours, read another sentence and have to do the same thing. I think like the first 8 pages of this book took me most of a day to get through in terms of the requisite research applied to it. And that when you get to the end of that chapter, you're like, oh man, the next one is only 6 pages. And oh man, it has the chums in it. It's going to be easier. And then he throws out just one last thing that makes you go nuts in the first paragraph. But then, almost as if he's realized what he's done to you, he doesn't put anything else in the rest of the chapter that really requires you to do any like heavy lifting. And so that was kind of a fun realization I had midway through this. But like the writing on it is really, really great. Kit's deepening character arc and characteristics are really interesting to see playing out. And again, I think the most important thing to me in these 2 chapters is the ways in which a lot of this stuff that he has set up hundreds of pages ago at this point, in some cases, are really starting to gel together in a way that becomes more and more evident, and how the spar relates to the bilocations and the kind of thin veneer of these 2 worlds that are traveling in parallel, and how that has a knock-on effect to how, you know, monarchies behave, and even just how like individual citizens behave, and all the sort of danger surrounding World War I coming just around the corner, but also World War II. Like he's doing so much heavy lifting for his book in this chapter that is really impressive, and just as I was frustrated. I wanted to throw the book out of a window at certain points, but also at the same time was just sort of in awe of what I was able to piece together through that research and through the experience of sticking to a close reading in the way that I have been doing.
Yeah, I mean, this is the chapter where it finally feels like kind of what you were saying, Kate. It feels like the Iceland Spar. It feels like the math. It feels like the like goofy scenes with the Chums of Chance are starting to actually coalesce into something. And for those of us who have not finished the book, I won't imply one way or the other whether it actually does coalesce, but it's really magical the way that Pynchon in 38 at least, and I would say to a much lesser extent 39, really excels at capturing the feeling of that coherency coming into view. Like to it's at this point a tired metaphor for his works, but it's a little bit like the magic eye thing, where you finally get the right focal length, and then suddenly you see the 3-dimensional shape, and you know that that can just be like repeated over and over and over again throughout chapter 38. But it's also, I mean, in terms of just sheer writing ability, like you said, Cody, I mean, and this isn't necessarily a mark of quality. There are a lot of sections in chapter 38 that feel like they're old, feel like they might have been written same time as some parts of Gravity's Rainbow. Just the style, the approach to writing that Pynchon is going into in this chapter. But those are not like even the most beautiful parts, even though my general taste tends to align with that book. There are just some incredible, it's in the things like that line about meeting someone by the mayonnaise works. Like it's there's some kind of erotic poetry that Pynchon is so amazing at that this chapter is just full of. And, I love the way that he sketches in both of these chapters this kind of almost a theory of his own historical fiction writing, of almost like, hey, sure, I'm changing historical events, yes, but what I'm really trying to do is underline that these things that we think of as inevitable weren't inevitable, but something like them was inevitably going to happen. It fits a kind. Something like Franz Ferdinand's assassination was going to happen eventually, but it could have been this other guy. Could have been this other person who no one remembers anymore. And it probably would have led to World War I just the same, maybe even a little sooner. But it didn't happen that way because whatever happened at the mayonnaise works happened. And it's, I love that. I love the fact that Pynchon isn't afraid to grab the bull by the horns and tell the reader, this is silliness. Take silly things seriously, though. And that's great. It's him at his best, and not, it I guess because it's my role. This is chapter 38 is the halfway point, or at least it surrounds the halfway point of the book. So there's some important things happening, even if it's not necessarily plot wise. For once, I guess.
Yeah, I like both of these chapters. I probably prefer chapter 38. There's a lot to like in it. I'm not sure I like it or love it quite as much as Cody, perhaps, or the rest of y'all. But I do really like it. I mean, part of I mean, the whole mayonnaise thing is partially horrifying to me, just because I really I've never been a big mayonnaise guy, and I, as an adult, have managed to almost completely avoid it. So there's an aspect of just kind of pure disgust with the end of chapter 38. Not like disgust with Pynchon or whatever, just with the scenario he created. It was just not one I would want to live through, I guess. And it did occur to me a little bit, just like, is he covered in mayonnaise? But like at the end of the chapter, like I guess he does go into the river, but I don't know. I feel like he'd still have remnants of mayonnaise on him and stuff. And that just kind of makes me want to throw up a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I don't really know how much I'll have to say over the coming few hours, just because I do really like these two chapters. Chapter 38, it is pretty easy to kind of maybe not like get lost in the sauce, but just kind of get lost in the language and the descriptions. It moves pretty quickly, even though, I mean, a lot happens in chapter 38. Yeah. And I mean, 39, and I like that a lot happens in 38, and then we move pretty quickly. And the character of like I forget the guy's name, who's like the bad guy in this chapter, but he's pretty interesting. I don't know, 39 I liked. It's nice that we get some more chum stuff. I did find it's a little bit more of a transitional chapter, I would say. Rather than like it's just, there's not a whole lot of plot advancement. I would argue, I could be wrong, but I don't think it's not super, it's just not very plot heavy. Looking over it, it's very dialogue heavy. Yeah, I mean, I do really like these two chapters, and especially the climax of 38. It is, if nothing else, very memorable.
So 38 begins with Kit arriving in the city of Ostend, where he is able to pick up his pay from his previous job as a fisherman and begin to scheme his way into Göttingen, where he's trying to get at the end of this sort of journey that's gone amok. And eventually, he finds himself arriving at a Quaternion convention that is ongoing in the city. And on 526, we get into the first of the big sort of historical backdrop that I feel like you need to have to understand what's going on here. And that is a quote here from 526 that says, "All this last week and this, Quaternioniers had been converging on Ostend to hold one of their irregularly spaced world conventions. in the wake of the transatlantic and unpleasantness of the 90s, known as the Quaternion Wars, in which Kit was aware that Yale, being home of Gibbsian vectors, had figured as a major belligerent, true Quaternionists, if not defeated outright, then at best having come to feel irrelevant, could be found these days wandering the world, dispersed under yellow skies of Tasmania, out in the American desert, up in the alpine wastes of Switzerland, gathering furtively in border town hotels, at luncheons and rented parlors, in hotel lobbies whose surfaces, varying in splendor from French velvet to aboriginal masonry, raised ensembles of echoes. They were eyed suspiciously by waiters who brought in and ladled from oversized alloyed steel kettles vegetables grown locally, whose names did not come readily to mind, or animal parts concealed by opaque sauces, particularly here in Belgium, forms of mayonnaise, whose color schemes ran to indigos and aquas, often quite vivid, actually. Yes, but what choices, if any, remained? Having been inseparable from the rise of the electromagnetic in human affairs, the Hamiltonian devotees had now fallen from grace, come to embody, for the established scientific religion, a subversive, indeed heretical faith, for whom proscription and exile were too good. Now, that is a good signpost of just how good the writing is going to be for the rest of this chapter, certainly, but it's also gesturing at a very real event. The whole paragraph is in reference to a fight over vector analysis. Hamilton, who carved his founding equation on a bridge, was in favor of utilizing quaternions. This, of course, is recounted by Kit much earlier in the book, particularly going and sort of seeing the equation that was engraved there. And for using algebra in multiple dimensions, which would help us lead to vector analysis. As I understand it, Will, feel free to correct any of my stuff on math. There's a lot of it in this chapter. I felt like I got closer to understanding it, but it's entirely possible that I'm still misunderstanding. Hamilton's followers tried for years to bring the potential of quaternions for this to fruition, but a new process of vector analysis developed by Olivier Heaviside and J. Willard Gibbs was gaining traction because it was proving useful where quaternions specifically were not proving useful, particularly in the realm of electromagnetism and in solving general physics problems. The quaternionists decided to seek support where they could, but ultimately lost the war over the course of about 36 publications in scientific journals in various countries of origin, university staff, and argumentation from 1890 to 1894. So why is any of this useful to the text? Here's at least my interpretation anywhere. Because the war is being fought over how our perception of the world is often formed, and then how we measure that perception. Perceptions of the world were changing all across the board in the late 1800s and early 1900s. That's in a lot of ways this book is about. And this specific battle had to do with evolutions in science around light, space, and time. Now that the somewhat magical theories of the aetherists had been defeated and that kind of age of esotericism was beginning to wane, what was the truth? How are we going to forge our next path forward? Interestingly enough, the victors of the Quaternion Wars, based on the lens of Against the Day, were allied to the school that Vibe sends his students to, Yale. So this sort of side of the equation, both from the standpoint of the institutions and also the mathematicians that are staffing that institution, are thematically aligned with power and capital from a standpoint of this book. Kit, who fancies himself a quaternionist but went to Yale, and he ends up well represented here as a man conflicted with who he was and what he wants to do. He has no desire to be Edison, he wants to be a Tesla. And so it's fitting that when he arrives in Europe, after leaving Yale, he ends up with the other sort of allied forces, so to speak. He's left the Axis and he's joined the Allies, both geographically and in terms of mathematics. Quaternions, interestingly enough, would eventually have a resurgence in how they could be useful, particularly in the realm of relativistic physics and time, which is also going to be a big part of these two chapters, as we'll get to. So it also makes perfect sense that Pynchon has decided to develop quaternions into a potential weapon in this book that, deals with a subplot involving the time travelers and what they may be up to. So that's something that you should have in the background of your mind for the historical context of this chapter.
Yeah, I think you basically covered the quaternion stuff in as much detail as it needs to be talked about, at least this for what we're talking about right now, on top of what we've discussed so far in covering Against the Day. But I would like to just add a note of another detail of the distinction between the quaternion mathematics and vector mathematics is that quaternions are always centered along something. There is an implied kind of relativity to the use of quaternion algebra that is avoided in vector analysis. And that's why vector analysis became so widespread, and that's why quaternions became limited in their applications, because when you have to like model the world around everything, it's a lot harder to make reductive models and imply that your scientific theories are more firmly grounded than they happen to be. For instance, one of the many things that it doesn't happen for sure, definitely never happens. There definitely isn't like a major issue in sciences with people just assuming their their consequences, I guess. And I think that's one of those issues that Pynchon really is trying to get at when he's talking about the things that are more often recognized or more widely seen as kind of like, oh, it's him being open-minded towards other ways of understanding the world, blah blah blah. Where he these specific chapters, specifically the quaternion versus vector thing, is really getting at the ways that the intellectual tools we have, whether we're talking about things in terms of quaternions or vectors, change how we think about our problems and therefore how we solve them. And if you're thinking about everything in this very fragmentary, very ad hoc kind of way that vectors are very good at, then that's what you're going to get as your solution, is fractured and ad hoc. Whereas metaphorically, I don't think Pynchon would say that we should not be using vectors for certain things in mathematics, but it does imply certain things about how you solve the problems as an engineer or how you look at economics.
So, as he arrives at the hotel, he is quickly introduced to a group of people attending the conference who style themselves as Young Congo. And this is where we are introduced to another major historical backdrop of this chapter, which has to do with the Belgian administration of the Congo during this time period. So, I've got another quote here as they describe on page 527 into 528. Each time a member of the Force Publique strikes a rubber worker or even speaks the simplest insult, the tidal forces intensify. The D-gay of contradiction grows ever weaker. This is a reference, and this whole interlude of who these guys are, what they are protesting against, has to do with, as I mentioned, King Leopold's control of the Congo Free State from 1885 to 1908. During this time, Leopold stripped the Belgian Congo of wealth in the form of both ivory and rubber, all through slave labor of the indigenous population. What made this situation unique, especially amongst a lot of the other colonial projects of the era, is that the king himself claimed ownership of the region. It was not just that Brussels or Belgium claimed ownership of the region. It was a personal possession to King Leopold. When many of the atrocities began to come to light, get a little bit of publication, and came to be wider known, the call was, of course, not for a total retreat of the Belgian forces. It was instead a call for a transfer of ownership from the king simply to the Belgian government, as if that would change anything. This was eventually completed in 1908. That was when it just became a Belgian colony, but nothing effectively changed on the ground for the actual people of the Congo and what was happening to them. Before any further action could take place, in fact, World War I had started, and so sort of global focus all got shifted from that to the exploding sort of war across Europe that was growing and getting bigger and bigger and worse and worse. What would eventually change things for the Congolese people was essentially the commercial farming of rubber trees, rather than harvesting sort of wild sources of it. In effect, the king, the king's administration of the Congo had effectively destroyed the native wild population of rubber trees and rubber plants, and so therefore they had to start farming them instead. And at that point, quotas got less involved, and a lot of the sort of atrocity that came along with these people meeting a quota also started to ebb away. And they had stopped trading ivory because they had effectively completely exhausted the country's supply of ivory as well from all of the actual local wildlife. However, the Congo is still not going to gain independence until 1960. So this remained a colonial project of Belgium's for a very long time. The term crimes against humanity would actually be first used in relation to the treatment of the natives by the Belgian forces. Women and children were often taken as hostages to force the husbands or the men of any given tribe into service to the Belgian Congo. Those husbands were then forced to work in slave labor. Flogging, torture, starvation, it was all normal and completely rampant. Murder was common, and not just individual instances of it. If a whole tribe of native peoples had sort of declined to work for King Leopold, then they would just wipe the whole tribe out, just be none left. Officials actually had a policy for a very long time that if one of the force publique, which will get referenced here in the book, went so far as to shoot somebody, they expected as proof of good usage of the bullet, the actual head of the man or woman or child that they killed. And so trading of body parts and heads in particular was incredibly widespread during this time. There was a lot of sexual slavery that was going on. Rape was constant. People would be tortured and killed if they didn't meet quotas. There's even a report of a sort of force publique, like high-ranking official, decorating a garden in his home with the heads of people that had been killed. He was using that as a border for the bounds of his garden. And so the name Young Congo is a very clear sort of portmanteau of this colony and the Young Turks. The Young Turks were effectively anti-monarchists in the Ottoman Empire towards the late Ottoman period. They stood in stark opposition to the Sultanate. So that's, I think, where Pynchon is pulling that, especially since they're in effect being against the colony. They're in fact sort of against the king. What they're ultimately arguing is, of course, that the atrocities being committed have brought the Belgians in line with the natives in terms of their condition. In essence, if the excuse for the brutality of the native people is that they are savages, then they have become savages themselves in how they have treated those people for the condition they've assigned to them. This is a very common feature of anti-colonialist literature. That is pretty much exactly what the purpose of the book Heart of Darkness is at its core, and Heart of Darkness is actually written about the Belgian Congo. So these two things are very much in conversation with one another as far as what they're responded to. And so in a very real, sort of palpable way, the Belgians have doomed themselves to thin out the Digue, which is, of course, a dike that controls, water from flooding the public. And the closer that they beat the native people of the Congo, the worse that they treat them, the closer it is that that dike is coming to breaking. And if that breaks, then sort of all hell breaks loose. And that idea of a dike or a wall getting thinner is a big part of this chapter too, in terms of the stuff that Pynchon is looking to explore. Mm-hmm. If you're looking to read more on the history of this, like I said, Heart of Darkness is going to be a response to it, but also the nonfiction book King Leopold's Ghost is a very well-researched, very well-written book on the Belgian Congo that I would highly recommend if people are looking for more information on that in particular. Do you guys have any thoughts on Young Congo, why they're named the way that they are, or any additional detail with them?
I will say that this is a very contentious thing to say, but I'm just gonna from the perspective that Pynchon has portrayed for the most part in his career, I don't think it's unrealistic to identify the Young Turks, the real historical Young Turks, not the Young Congo, as if not fascist, then proto-fascist in pretty much every way that matters. And one of the 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 truest signs of the coming political trends across Europe and the world in the 20th century, in that way. And so, by contradiction, the Young Congo here are this kind of by remove, activist group who do seem 100% dedicated to their cause, but they are not within it, and so they are not fascist. Almost like I don't know if that's the logic he's working with there, but there's almost something like that going on, and it's interesting.
I do find the line or the small part of the conversation where Dennis or whatever says their unremitted suffering, their moral superiority, and then it's hardly they are as savage and degenerate as Europeans. I mean, I don't really have much to say about the whole savage and degenerate thing, but I do think that it is interesting that Pynchon includes at least one character who, doesn't believe in. I think it's like the happy native trope, like cliche.
Yeah,
The savage.
Yeah, noble savage. Yeah, where the line, their unremitted suffering, their unmerited suffering. Dennis suggested their moral superiority. I mean. Yeah, it's nice that that's subverted a little bit. I mean, I wouldn't really, even if it wasn't subverted, I still would find it interesting and perhaps worth commenting on. But I just like that little detail. And I don't know, I do find it interesting, perhaps just a little bit to think about Gravity's Rainbow here, just with Gravity's Rainbow and even V's depiction of the Herero genocide. I think one of the reasons that Pynchon doesn't go into what was happening in the Congo as much as he does go into that stuff in what was going on in Namibia, modern day Namibia, in V and Gravity's Rainbow, because I feel like he probably felt like it was that ground had already been covered. It's with the Heart of Darkness. People that are going to read Against the Day and get this far into Against the Day are going to have at least a passing familiarity with the Heart of Darkness. And I think it's interesting that he doesn't really go off and go on to all this stuff about it. I do think it's just at least partially because, like I said, it's pretty well trodden ground in Western literature at this point, basically solely because of the Heart of Darkness, I think. If not for the Heart of Darkness, I'm just saying like that whole genocide and all the terrible things that were going on would not be as well known, I guess. So
they comment in a couple of different ways about how common it is becoming for political leaders to be either assassinated or for an assassination attempt to be made on them. And eventually they work around to trying to sort of recruit Kit into their organization for the purpose of potentially trying to assassinate King Leopold, because after all, he is a Yankee from the Wild West where they must shoot each other every single day.
all they do.
The exchange, if someone wants to read on 529 about how many people he's killed at the top of the page, is great if someone wants to read it.
Oh yeah, I love that. I'll just start at the top of the page and go to that line. Something in the Pickwick family might do nicely, Fatou went on, deploying maps and diagrams about the tiny room. Bruguere's powders say. Always been a Desert Knolls man myself, murmured Dennis. Or we might hire an American gunslinger, Eugene gazing meaningfully at Kit. Heck, mademoiselle, you don't want to be letting me near a gun. I'd need steel shoes just to protect my feet. Come, Kit, you can tell us. How many desperados have you drilled daylight through? Hard to say. We don't start counting till it's over a dozen. I love that line. Kit in this chapter is so overly confident and just really kind of coming into his own, and it's so much fun to read.
Yeah, it is. These guys seem like they would probably be fun to hang out with. They're drinking absinthe all the time.
Yeah.
They're talking about assassinating political leaders.
They're definitely much more motivated than the nihilists from the Big Lebowski,
Yeah,
Just
that's for
drink
sure.
whiskey and pass out in pools.
And then we are introduced to Rocco and Pino, who are sort of absconding with and testing the first versions of the torpedoes, which were actually manned, if I understand properly what is being referred to there. Do you guys have any thoughts on Rocco and Pino that you wanted to share?
I find that particularly interesting, and I find it kind of funny in a way, like how their torpedo works, where like they kind of just have to set it right next to the target and then like run away really fast to get away from it before it explodes. That kind of prototypical explosive, I guess, for lack of a better term. Like just seeing the way in which that technology evolves, and you never really can, like, you always kind of think of the modern iteration of it, right? You never really think about like where it evolved from and the kind of goofiness that can be involved in doing all that, like this particular thing of just like, yeah, we made this really cool torpedo. It doesn't really work at a long distance, so you kind of have to get like right up on the thing and basically make them touch and then just get away.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too many specific thoughts about them, I guess. I find them entertaining. I find them, not super interesting, but they are kind of they're a little bit of like a Misha and Grisha. Um,
Yeah.
they-
Yeah. That's a good, yep.
That's a good comparison.
yeah, I mean they're similarly technically minded, they're similarly ambitious, they're similarly gung ho in their ambition.
They don't have sharp metal teeth.
they don't have sharp
That I
metal
know.
teeth, but they are Italian.
Eventually, one of the members of the conference named Barry Nebulae introduces Kit to Miss Umeki Surgane. I'm going to say is how that's pronounced. I'm probably very wrong. She was a former student of Professor Knott while he was in Japan. This is referring to Cargill Knott, a Scottish physicist and mathematician who later became a seismologist. He worked extensively in Japan and was in support of the Quaternius side of the wars of the 1990s. And they get to talking, flirting a little bit, and eventually she brings him to another party. But there's an interesting line that she says here about how anyone in the faith, referring specifically to Quaternianism or a belief in Quaternians as being something that you have faith in a way that really sort of denotes a religiosity, which stood out to me. And it really seems to cement, and I'm going to get to this argument once we get to the bottom of page 533. It really begins to cement the idea that there is like a dividing line between these in Pynchon's mind of the Vectorists and the Quaternists, of the new world versus the old world, or the magic versus the science, or the esotericism versus the sort of like strict logician nature of the new world and the new order and way of doing things. So I wanted to ask you guys if you had any thoughts on this character and the kind of back and forth she has with Kit before they run out to the Grand Salon.
I would like to point out her introduction because it's kind of funny when you think about how she's being presented here. On 532, it says, around her slender neck, the beauteous Asian was also wearing a furoshiki printed in a woodland motif of peacock blue, taupe, and Chinese red, folded into a triangle so as to make a cowgirl bandana, and knocking back boilermakers and their helpers at an astonishing pace. A modest betting pool had already developed over how long she might keep it up before paralysis in some form set in. So here's this beautiful Asian woman who's dressed like a cowboy, kind of, and is just hammering boilermakers left and right to the point that other people in the bar are genuinely concerned for her well-being.
They're taking bets on when she's going to pass out.
But that being said, like I like the interactions between her and Kit. There's also some, just before we get to the end of 533, because there's a couple of interesting kind of things that pop up in here. The reference of aniline teal is a nice little drop in, as that is a specific dye that was used around the World War II era. And it comes into play pretty heavily in Gravity's Rainbow. That's one of the things that IG Farben is making. And then also the mention of intensely hoarse disputes in fluent Esperanto and idiom neutral. It's fucking hilarious. If anyone is unfamiliar with either of those, they are failed attempts at invented languages that never really took off.
Inventing a
Esperanto is
universal
probably
language.
universal. Sorry. Esperanto is probably the more well known of these and is still somewhat practiced today, but
You can take it on Duolingo.
you can take it on Duolingo. You can also take Klingon on Duolingo for that, whatever's that worth. That's worth. So let's not
Salve,
put too much stock
amikoi.
into that.
It's I'll say Esperanto is worth if you're someone who's curious about learning a language. It's a good way to dip your foot into it because it is so straightforward because it was invented that it's
Mhm.
just a good thing for your brain. You know, if you're one of those people who's worried about dementia, no, you're hitting your 50s.
Hey, whoa.
I said nothing of that would refer that to you. I promise. But I mean, yeah, I mean, aside from theoretical issues, Esperanto is a failure, but it's not quite dead. You can still go couch surfing based on speaking Esperanto alone, which is a thing for some reason. But there are some. The the promise of the universal auxiliary language is not dead. It's just it's
Just
drowned.
sleeping.
It's like
Just sleeping
anarchist
on a series of
communism.
couches.
There's no future for it, but it has hopes and dreams.
It'll be a real boy one day.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, I agree. I love the way that Surigane is kind of is depicted in almost exactly the way that, like, I don't know if any of y'all or any of the listeners were familiar with this side of journalism, but like that the remaining side of like hacker culture that wasn't completely subsumed by the tech monopolists in like the early 2010s. This is how the people who were like doing things would get depicted is as this kind of character who is just like blown into this almost supernaturally bizarre shape where not like Nikola Tesla earlier in the book. She is a person with real ideas and real thoughts who actually like has a conversation with Kit, and it's actually a coherent one. And sure, she might be mystical in some way, but it's incidental. And I don't know, it's interesting to see that same kind of language being used for this first historical figure who is like actually like probably like it, as much as we have records of who Tesla was, I don't think that Pynchon probably strove to depict him as he was. This feels like he probably was trying to depict this real historical figure, and it's interesting, I guess, to see that as a contrast.
Does someone want to read the paragraph from 533 that Cody read the last sentence of? I love that whole depiction of just how rowdy this party has gotten.
Kit threaded his way out into the grand salon, wallpapered in aniline teal and a bright, though sour orange, to appear floral in theme. To appearances floral in theme. Though few would insist on it, lit by hundreds of modern-looking sconces, each quarter shade of Congo ivory scraped thin as paper to let its electric bulb shine through. Roisteringly seethed tonight with quaternion airs from around the globe. All persuasions, not to mention apostates therefrom, quasi-Gibbsites and pseudo-heavy-siders and full-bore grass maniacs milling about, more than in the mood for a clam bake, eccentrically attired, negligently when not defectively groomed, all with perhaps no more than the usual quota of barking and drooling, gossiping breathlessly about vacant appointments, compulsive marriages, cretinous colleagues, and real estate both overpriced and otherwise, scribbling on one another's attire, performing with cigarettes and banknotes feats of vanishing and restoration right up in one another's faces, drinking monopole de la maison, dancing on tabletops, exhausting the patience of wives, vomiting into the pockets of strangers, getting into long, intensely hoarse disputes in fluent Esperanto and idiom neutral, the technical discussions being in large part impenetrable, the phatic or sociable chit chat tending to the only slightly less problematic.
And they will go on to describe sort of the fact that the war is over, that the Vectorists have won and they've firmly lost. And there's a couple of names mentioned there in the chunk of text that Luke read out. The first is Olivier Heaviside. He was a self-taught electrical engineer, mathematician, and physicist who adapted complex numbers to the study of electrical circuits. He also developed techniques for applying Laplace transforms to differential equations. He also rewrote Maxwell's field equations in terms of electric and magnetic forces, was a co-formulator of vector analysis, and was responsible for inventing the coaxial cable and formulating the telegrapher's equations. For much of his life, he was at odds with the mathematical estate, and he would eventually become a major figure in many different areas because he was just proved right time and time again. But evidently there was some criticism from sort of the establishment, so to speak, about the fact that he was a self-taught individual. So therefore he couldn't have access to all of this knowledge, or he couldn't be that smart. Hermann Grassmann was a linguist and mathematician. He was a physicist, a scholar, and a publisher. He is most known for the discovery of vector space, stating that once geometry is placed into algebraic form, the number 3 has no privileged role as the number of spatial dimensions, which makes the possible number of dimensions unbounded. He was also a minister and theologian before he became a mathematician. So these men, along with Gibbs, formed the sort of anti-quaternion forces that would eventually win this war. Now, forgive me if the stuff that I'm about to talk about was something that we did cover, at least in part, with the Tetractys when it first gets mentioned, I don't know, 400 pages ago, or whenever that was. But this page, 533, continues on to a line here that says, "We are the Jews of mathematics, wandering out here in our diaspora, some destined for the past, other for the future, even a few able to set out at unknown angles from a simple line of time upon journeys that no one can predict." The Tetractys was utilized as a basis for the tree of life within Kabbalistic Judaism, which developed in the exile. So if you connect all of those dots together, here's where I think Pynchon is building to. And we had talked about the tree of life a little bit within the initial mention of the Tetractys a long time ago, because I believe it's directly in the text as being part of the wardrobe of one of the priests in that cult. But what we find here is the Quaternionists putting themselves in the same league of these Jews wandering in exile. And of course, part of that is what came out of the exile as far as a principal evolution in Judaism, and that's the Kabbalah, which has this internal connection. Here's the interesting, though, relevant to the broader themes of the book is the fact that Hamilton, after discovering the Quaternions, would write a sonnet called the Tetractys that attempted to connect his new finding to the mysticism of the Pythagoreans, and in particular, the Pythagorean theory of the number 4. Now, again, I'm sorry if I'm repeating anything, but I don't remember us talking about this back when this was introduced. If this book represents the final passing of the old esoteric world that linked sort of ritual magic, science, and mysticism together, then Hamilton and the Quaternions represent this sort of final battle over that change happening from the mathematical realm. The fact that the Qs lost to the Vectorists can easily symbolically fit when this broader theme of the passing of the old world comes into play along with the shaping of a new one. Yet, Quaternions would have their return, their revenge. As I mentioned, they would largely deal with time and have a place in relativistic physics. And so, in a way, this book is acknowledging that the use of this sort of magic, this esotericism, this remnant of the old world still has relevance to the modern age. We just haven't found it yet, I think, is what he's kind of utilizing this for, at least in part. Of course, in the book, they are also pivotal because they're used to manipulate time and reality. But even a devotion to them in an academic sense limits or links you rather to this sort of esoteric world and esoteric society that is passing away. So you can go and find the sonnet pretty easily. We recorded one for the beginning of this episode that you guys have already heard. And I think that it's interesting because the number 4 makes up the bottom of the pyramid, which is often seen as the foundational structure of the universe and justice. If you were to look at the Tetractys, just like go to the Wikipedia page, it's there, as well as what the different layers of it stand for. And they saw the number 4 as the sort of key bearer of the universe, that this sense of foundations and justice need to underpin everything else. So thusly, it might be said that Hamilton was trying to give us a way to surf the universe, find our way through it in an exploratory fashion, getting to the truth of that foundational elements that the Pythagoreans were talking about, using quaternions from a Pynchonian perspective. I can't speak to if that's what he was trying to do in real life. It seems like this was kind of viewed as pretty nutty when he published the sonnet. Also of interest is that the sonnet seems to make references not only to the manipulation of time for the purposes of ideas, which is certainly relevant to the book, but it also seems to indicate the cyclical nature of the world itself, which is something that is very key to Pynchon's work across the board, in terms of this idea of him receiving thoughts or ideas from ancient civilization and putting them back into context and connecting these two time periods together is very much what is happening in the latter half of it. So this quote likens the cues to wandering Jews, which is apt given that the Tetractys would later be used as the basis for the Kabbalistic tree of life design, which effectively serves the same purpose in Judaism as the Tetractys did for the Pythagoreans. There's also an interesting thing that happens a little bit later in the book, in which one of the quaternionists does yoga, and that the yoga that he is involved in, or the sort of yoga-like stretching that he's involved in, has to do with the study of quaternions itself. Kabbalistic ritual and practice also has sort of a Jewish version of yoga, in which the different poses and stretches that they do are aligned with prayers or with particular sort of meanings to that esoteric religion. So certainly, I think this is also very important in that he is unifying elements of Eastern religions from multiple sort of points of origin, along with math and along with sort of an old history of scientific discovery linked with religiosity in the Pythagoreans, to kind of create a unified Gnostic belief that is coming out of the quaternions, essentially, which of course holds relevance to the previous passages in their attempts to find Shambhala and all of the Gnostic detail we went into there. So this is in my mind the importance of the quaternions to like this chapter and to some of the broader thematic context of the book. But of course, I want to ask if you guys have anything that you want to add to that, or any additional thoughts that you have in response to this chunk of the chapter.
I think you might have landed on something that I have not really considered, and it yeah, I know you mentioned that whole concept of the Kabbalistic nature of it kind of ties into everything that's going on in the book, but I would even say you could blow that out to it tying into a lot of what he does in his other work.
Mm.
And I think so much of Against the Day kind of acts as I guess in a way like a sort of grand cover of everything he's been doing. It's kind of the center point from which everything else he's done past and future from this novel kind of expands from. And so I think when you can find that particular connection and start making that connection, like plugging it in, so to speak, into other elements of his other works and how they connect to this and to each other, I think it really, you've kind of helped open this up in a way that I hadn't really ever seen before. So it's going to color I think the way I look at this going forward as well. which is good. And I just have to kind of chew on this for a while. And when I say a while, I mean like the rest of this podcast and probably every time I read this book after it.
Yeah, I think I can't remember how long ago it was that I referred to it, but it really does feel like Against the Day is the Rosetta Stone of his bibliography.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll just say that I think you've basically gotten to at least the root of why this whole quaternion thing is here and why it's being used in the way it is. So yeah, just in case you wanted that validation. there you have it.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are like little things you could read into this section, but I don't know if there's any point in doing that.
Fair enough. Eventually, Kit is reintroduced to his old pal Root, who seems to have arrived in the same position, even though he took sort of the different version of the Stupendica. This has some resonance with literally the next chapter, in which a phrase is used referring to plasmic hysteresis. And hysteresis on its own is the idea that two identical processes can arrive at the final destination by two different paths. So again, even within just like something immediately surrounding the center of the book, and then just after the center of the book, where there's these similarities that exist within there in like a really crazy way. And Root gives him sort of a check in on what it is that he's been up to, and the fact that certainly quaternionists are all viewed as insane and maniacs, and that the real maniacs though have gone into theory. They've gone to get really abstract in what is all going on. It has nothing to do with the real mathematics. I don't know if this is necessarily talking about like the explosion of quantum theory and quantum physics and relativistic physics that would of course lead to the atom bomb, which ends World War II. Feels like there might be a reference in there to that, or if it's just a comment on the direction of mathematics and physics at the time. But there's also an interesting line on here of 535 where it says, like, it's a race to see who can venture out furthest into the borderlands of the non-existent, not strictly speaking mania, not as we once knew it, the good old days. Grassman was German and hence automatically among the possessed. Hamilton was burdened with an early genius and in the grip of a first love he could never get beyond. That is a comment on sort of how things are vertically integrated, I feel, in the sense of the race to venture out the furthest into the borderlands of the non-existent is both true of mathematics at this point. It is also true of colonial projects and how these two things are accomplishing different goals, but are again going about it in different pathways, or taking different meanings out of that sort of prescription for the day and age that existed. And in this line, Hamilton was burdened with early genius and in the grip of a first love he could never get beyond. I feel like that is also potentially related to Pynchon's career. I can't prove that it is a self-insert line, but it really does kind of feel like this book is deliberately an attempt to upstage Gravity's Rainbow or evolve Gravity's Rainbow into the next kind of evolution of his style and meaning that you could get out of a text. They say that he has like three big books: Gravity's Rainbow, Mason and Dixon, and this one. Mason and Dixon doesn't really hold a candle to the other two in terms of its complication, or I think the level of meaning that it has. It gets close in some respects, especially towards the end, but certainly not pound for pound in the way that Against the Day does. But it does. So it seems like I already kind of told this theory to Cody just in a off mic conversation. It seems like to me that you could apply this to Pynchon in the sense that he released Gravity's Rainbow and then was like never really able to get beyond that. That no matter how hard he tried, no matter what else he tried to work on, Gravity's Rainbow just followed him around everywhere. Mm-hmm. It was his first love in the sense that it's what he had dedicated his most, effort and his most time and his most writing ability to at that present moment when it was released. And that even if he manages to move beyond that and do something else, it's always just going to be about that.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. And I think it's either earlier in this book or it's in Mason and Dixon. It might be both even, where I've made similar connections to this sort of self-insert of like of appreciating the appreciation of Gravity's Rainbow, but trying to emphasize that like that's not it. That's not all of it. Like you're not. I think maybe by focusing solely on that book, you're kind of neglecting to see the overarching theme and story that's taking place and everything else. If that's the case, he's definitely not wrong. And I think that's something that a lot of people in the Pinchon community tend to, I don't want to say forget, but it seems too often that people focus solely on Gravity's Rainbow as if it's the only thing he's written that's worth reading. And that's far from the case. And I think that it shows in critical reviews of his work. Everything always comes back to Gravity's Rainbow. It was his best book since Gravity's Rainbow. It's not as good as Gravity's Rainbow. It's always coming back to that. And I think that there's no way an author like Pinchon, who is working on levels that most authors can only dream of reaching. And I'm not saying that as like a sort of like overly praising him we're doing a whole podcast about him. What I'm saying is like, I think he has a grander scheme for his work. And I think it's that there's this sort of layered sort of presentation of all of it to where it all works into itself. It all feeds into itself and it all plays off of itself. And you can't really just isolate one of these works and say, this is it. This is the only one that you should read and so on and so forth. Because I think that if you do that, you're minimizing your ability to take in what it is he's working at and has been working at his whole career.
I think that's a really good way to put it. All in all.
All right. So Root decides to take Kit to the casino and show him the ways in which quaternions can be used to win him money. And that somehow they managed to turn this into a way to cheat at poker or other sort of casino games.
Yeah, they Rain Man it.
Yeah. It's a very interesting interlude here, especially because that when they eventually pick up what's her name? I'm looking at the page and I can't even find it. Pleiade. She actually wins money. So like it does seem to work in some way, but is in absolutely incredibly complicated to the point where Root needs to keep track of like atmospheric conditions, the angle,
pressure changes,
the pressure changes, all of that. But I've already mentioned Pleiade, who Kit runs into. He seems to have a habit of running into women. He runs into, of course, Dally, and then he's introduced to the woman at the bar earlier in this chapter, and now he meets Pleiade. What do we think of this character? There is much hand-wringing over what her name might mean in the Pinchon Wiki.
God.
And several different theories. The Pinchon Wiki for these two chapters is kind of insane. But what do you guys think of Pleiade?
Does anyone have thoughts on Pleiade? I was going to talk about Root real quick. Okay. But if anybody has anything on Pleiade, I'd defer to them. But I think Root is an interesting character, if only because this idea of him sort of having to, he has this like anxiety about his abilities to kind of deceive people using math, but then he's also very assured in it, which is interesting because, you have this at the beginning of 538, he's talking about how his eyeballs are all but whirling in their sockets, chips spilling everywhere, one tucked absent-mindedly behind each of his ears. Card values, time of day, should have logged them, might as well have been random luck. He pulled from his pocket a battered slip of paper covered with formulae, full of upside-down triangles, capital S's and small Q's, and frowned at it. Think I'd better adjust some parameters here. Room temperature, punter, irrationality index, 1 or 2 coefficients in the retroversion matrix. So he's like, clearly, he's either genuinely like anxious about making sure that everything is right, or he's really hamming it up to impress Pleiade. Because he then tells her, when she kind of expresses a concern about like, oh, well, what if security gets onto us? He says, oh, we're safe. They're looking for the latest thing, nickel prisms and stroboscopic monocles and wireless telegraph rigs in people's shoes. But our magic is more ancient, and the big advantage to being outmoded is that nobody recognizes it when they see it. So aside from the sort of shift from, this anxious, I have to have everything in control and make sure that I'm doing everything right to do this right, to this very self-assured, like, oh, we're not going to get caught because they're not looking for what we're doing. But at the same time, I think that's also commenting on, and this is something that's going to come up a little bit later on 541 too, on the inherent power of mathematics and how they can and have been bent to the will of humans to do good and evil, mostly evil, if we're being honest. Like, math has done a lot of good, but it's also been responsible for a lot of, historical deaths and horrific events and things like that. So I think Root is kind of emblematic of showing that sort of darker side of math. And like, it's fun to think about him going in and using his skill and applying it to, extract a bunch of money from a casino who, probably really truly doesn't deserve it. And, we can enjoy watching that. But then at the same time, you can take that same skill, you can take those same abilities and use them to create an atomic bomb. And I think Root, is also, that name is probably doing a lot of important work that I haven't fully caught, but I'm sure there's a mathematical aspect to his name as well, beyond just the simple idea of a square root. I'm sure there's some logarithmic function or something like that it ties into. But yeah, I think this is where this chapter really starts to kick into high gear for me. And as someone who really doesn't comprehend a lot of the math that's in here, I still find it fascinating, and I do my best to try to really like grasp at what its important is in relation to the text.
So I guess I'll jump in to say that just because you mentioned it, Cody, on 535, there's an exchange where Kit says, got drafted into the Navy, I think. Nothing's been rigorously what you'd call real lately. And refer back to last episode's discussion of the zeta function, or was it even the episode prior
It was
to that?
2 episodes ago, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. The zeros in the function are the roots of the function in that kind of graphical analysis. It's where the lines intersect with the zero.
Yes, that's right.
And
Okay.
yeah,
You
and when
mentioned
it
that.
comes to the Riemann hypothesis, that has to do with the arrangement of prime numbers, roughly. And remember, like early on in the book, we also had a character named Re Ipso, which is a pun on Latin meaning the thing itself. And I'm pretty sure a lot of other side characters whose names basically mean either some mathematical pun on root or ground, or some pun on truth or reality. So there's that. I'm not sure what I would make of it other than it's something like the Slothrop exclusion zone thing, right? In Gravity's Rainbow, not to bring that in contradictory to last few minutes of conversation, but there's something like that's going on. Whether or not in this book we're supposed to see these things as purely fantastical or not, like we are for some aspects of Gravity's Rainbow, there's definitely something going on either in that realm or in the metaphysical realm, which is the way that things like the Stupendica split, and or the way that what happens in chapter 39 happen. And I guess to continue on talking about the math of it all, I guess a historical moral panic around this time was around Baccarat Chemin de Fer, which is a style of Baccarat that's incredibly fast paced. And it's like multiple decks are played with at once, and you can have multiple stakes at once as an individual player, and you can win or lose bigly very quickly. And as such, the moral panic was about people becoming gambling addicts, because if you have an element of skill like you do in Baccarat, at least in Chemin de Fer, it's really easy for people to get hooked on the feeling of getting better at whatever it is that they are gambling with, and therefore develop a gambling addiction that is simultaneously the mental sensation of learning how to do a skill. And I think that's part of what's going on with all these quaternionists. Sure, they genuinely, and the reason people don't play baccarat that way anymore is because it's, the house has an edge, but you can be good at it, and it's not quite like blackjack where you can always shuffle around the players to eventually get a break even point for the casino. But I think a way to compare this, it's a little bit like a bunch of probability and statisticians going into a casino to play video blackjack. It's like they're and yes, obviously video blackjack is specifically designed to be resistant to this kind of thing.
Right.
But that's yeah, like these people are going in there with an edge and they're using it to the best of their abilities, but they're also becoming like convinced that they're seeing through the matrix of reality in the same way that like Root is like I don't think he's playing it up, I guess is my answer to to your implied question. Is I
Okay.
think that's his mental faculty starting to break down in the context of a kind of toxic thing for the human mind. And I think that ties into the way that math is used, I guess, in that historical sense that you referred to, where it's previously these people are all sitting around talking about using quaternions for revolution of human society, and now they're just focused on getting rich. And they're getting focused on getting rich too. And I guess as far as Pleiade, however you want to pronounce it, I guess. I'm not sure. I don't know how you pronounce that. It feels kind of like though this is a comment on not a comment necessarily, but she stands as a counterpoint to Kit, where Kit is someone who can speak the language and hang with all these people who have these revolutionary intentions, and they don't really have a reason to trust him. And Pleiade comes in, and she is willing to ask the questions the right way and willing to listen to them in a way that sets off maybe Kit's paranoia, but no one else's, it seems. And it's kind of getting at, the way that the flaneur is used in spy fiction, right?
Mhm.
But I don't have much more I don't have many more thoughts about her, at least in this part of the chapter, because she does seem so kind of, such the femme fatale.
Directly build off that, because I've actually been thinking about this for a while now. Or just a few minutes, but relatively a while. So thank you for bringing up the femme fatale stuff, because I do think it's Pleiade, because I think with that type of accent mark, if she has a French name, that type of accent mark means that the E would be pronounced like an A, I think. So I think it would be Pleiade. I don't know. But anyway, she does kind of remind me like the intro of her. I mean, besides the whole asymmetrical makeup thing, which is not very James Bond, I do think there is kind of a Bond girl aspect to Pleiade, kind of throughout this chapter, but especially in her introduction. I don't really know how much more I really have to add to that, but it just comes to mind that James Bond does come to mind. I mean, Kit is not like James Bond at all, which is nice. And I would be kind of annoyed if he suddenly turned into somebody like that. I mean, even just in terms of smoothness with women. I mean, it doesn't mean I ain't been up and down some boulevards, Kit declared, in and out some hallway doors. I mean, it's not a bad line, but it's just a little kind of, I don't know, juvenile maybe. And he kind of generally comes off in that short conversation where they're introducing or they're just talking to each other. He does come across maybe a little bit naive. I do think it's interesting that she accuses him of being a jewel thief and saying that she can't trust him. That's a manipulation tactic that human beings will do to other human beings, is accuse them of what they're doing. Not that she's stealing his jewels, but she wants to deceive him and is deceiving him, perhaps even initially. I mean, I don't know, it's not even really implied that it's somehow planned or that her boyfriend her partner or whatever got her to meet Kit, especially or anything. But I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I would
I
certainly
think it's
say.
interesting.
Go ahead, Cody.
I was just gonna say the Bond girl connection is an interesting one with her that I hadn't really considered, but it kind of does make sense looking back at her characterization throughout the chapter and the way, especially towards the end of the chapter, because she is the one who whispers to Kit to meet her at the mayonnaise factory, and
The mayonnaise work.
mayonnaise works. Sorry, and it yeah, like you've got me thinking on that now, and I think that's definitely that could be a very big inspiration for her character.
Calling it the mayonnaise works is so important for the time period.
I know.
Work. Femme Fatale or Bond Girl is definitely correct because not only, is her introduction almost like a camera panning up from a roulette wheel to reveal kind of the beautiful woman who has just played the roulette wheel,
Mhm.
but also the sort of like smoking, the sort of inherent like oversexed nature of her character in many ways, and then eventually, she proves to be at least in on something of an espionage operation of some kind.
Yeah.
So she's an interesting presence in the book, and again, we're seeing things happen in pretty short order from one another that are similar. The section of the book is bilocations. We're passing through the center of the book, and we're seeing things be reincorporated. It's a really interesting way that Pynchon is kind of doing some of this mirroring, especially with that character. But Pleiade, I believe, is what Luke said to suggest as far as pronunciation. So Pleiade goes and gambles with them and meets the Quaternionists and tries to understand who they are, is asking some questions, and wins a bunch of money. This is also where the previous thing about yogic instruction comes in, which I sort of already mentioned a little bit ago. But we learn that Pleiade is not all that she seems. She is working with one Piet. I don't know how that last name would be pronounced if it was a Belgian man.
No, I am not even gonna try.
I'm just gonna say Piet Hoover is a former member of the Force Publique who is a very Pynchonian kind of villain character. This like guy with a jaded backstory, carrying a lot of karmic debt, but that has a lot more on his mind in terms of capacity and his ability to kind of see things for how they are. And he is a great example of the D-gay getting smaller. There's a line on 541 there. It says, Hoover watched her leave the room. Women looked better from behind, but one saw them that way only when taking their leave after one was done with them. And what good was that? Why did this society insist on a woman entering a room face first instead of ass first? Another of the civilized complexities that made him intensely miss the forest life. Since returning to Belgium, he had found only an increasing number of these, deployed around him like traps or mines. They need not to offend the king to remain aware of rival bureau and their own hidden schemes to calibrate everything against the mortal mass of Germany, forever towering over the day. So this is exactly what the young Congo member is talking about when he's talking about the D-gay is getting thinner, the veneer between the supposed society of the Belgians and the sort of supposed savagery or uncivilizedness of the Congolese people. It's exactly what's going on here. And I hate that Pynchon writes this kind of character so well because every time another one of them comes up, whether it's Windust, whether it's, Brock Vond, whether it's this guy, like they always have this sort of, I guess, the inherent charisma of the evil in the way that they are so sort of self-assured in their own city, their own like shittiness. They're all it's like Michael Pemulus. It's like the same problem that I have with Michael Pemulus. They would all be great used car salesmen.
Holy shit, would they?
And this is just another one of those cases. And he has effectively been given the job for another organization. He's of the mindset that what's wrong with, being on multiple payrolls? What's wrong with being on multiple takes? As long as they don't know that I'm doing it for each other, what's the big deal? And so he's working for somebody to investigate the Quaterniist convention and see if it has an anarchic component. So again, we're layering in another big part of what's going on in this book in terms of the different spaces that Pynchon is investigating and kind of identifying with this period of history in a way that is just, it's very impressive. Like what you said at the beginning of the episode, Cody, of just like, I'm never going to be as good of a writer as Pynchon. No writer makes me feel that more than Wallace and Pynchon. Those are the two that really give me that feeling. And certainly this was about the time that it really started to happen to me as I was reading the chapter.
Yeah, and to back up just a hair from what you just read, we get a little bit more sense, and again, this ties into the Bond Girl thing about Pleiade and her using her femininity to extract information when needed, because you have this exchange on 541, as if you hadn't had enough to put up with. Pleiades La Frise remarked later, "That's all the sympathy I get? Oh, was there some other stipulated amount? Did you sneak that into our agreement too, with invisible ink? What we like tonight, though, is a look through his room. Can you keep him occupied for an hour or so?" Her hands had been busy with his person. She hesitated, thinking it over, until she sensed some brutal imminence, then continued. Later in her bath, she inspected a number of bruises and decided they were all charming, except for one on her wrist, which to a connoisseur might have suggested absence of imagination. So this idea that she knows what she's doing, and she's very willing and able to use that against people to extract information when she needs it. But she also realizes that it's kind of all fun and games until it's not. And there's those elements of danger that she still has to deal with. And, the reminders that are left on her and that kind of haunt her there. So I that's just a beautiful, subtle little addition to her character there, but it's one that I really liked.
I did want to point out that the paragraph that Kate read out is maybe the purest distillation of Pynchon's villains and maybe any of his books, the most succinct at least.
Yeah.
Distillation where it's, if somebody were to ask me, describe a Pynchon villain, I would just point them to that paragraph. I mean, you have it's either it's at best objectifying, at worst misogynistic, perspective on sex, the need, the missing of combat, which I feel white, or missing of whatever in the past, which I feel Weissman kind of has, and Vaughn would have just as a conservative, and the needing to not offend the king or whatever to please the superiors. Even the stuff about Commander Ware of Rival Bureau, that's very Brock Vaughn, I feel and their own hidden schemes, stuff like that. And it's just a great paragraph. Yeah.
I suppose I would like to insert just a little bit of historical context of my own too. I guess just kind of the whole Pleiad and Piet Wouver, however the hell it's pronounced, thing, where basically right around this point in time, there was a very popular exotic dancer that we've all heard of called Mata Hari, who, leading up to World War One, had been solicited to be a spy for France, I think was the first one. And then, because she wasn't very savvy, thought that it was a good idea when she was in Germany to take up the German military intelligence offer to work for them as well. And it seems like she didn't give either side, so to speak, any decent intel. But when she ended up going to the UK, they were like, "Hey, now something suspicious is going on here. You're working for one of our allies and one of our enemies." And that's how she got sentenced to death, is because exactly this gambit, which kind of the way that it's being depicted here is probably how it was. That is to say, there were a lot of people doing that. She was just a very visible example, and the British government wanted to make an example.
That's great historical context. I had no idea.
It's not widely talked about. I highly recommend looking into Mata Hari, because she is a much, obviously, I think to the modern eye, a sympathetic person, but she's a much more interesting person in her historical context than we give her credit for. She was not just an exotic dancer. She was also one of the first exotic dancers. She gave us that name, essentially.
On 542, we are introduced to the idea that there is this intelligence of a quaternionic weapon going around, and that's what they're really sort of after the details for. There's a reference here to a Edmund Whittaker. He is interesting because he wrote a book on the history of aether theory in 1910 and was trying to discuss the development of the aether science into electrical science. So again, another one of these guys who's trying to kind of unify the old mysticism or the old outdated, seemingly outdated methods of thinking with something more modern. And Kit, sort of feeling smitten, decides that he would like to see Pleiade again, and so goes to her suite. And all that is present in her suite is just a dressing gown standing on edge. Does someone want to read the paragraph starting at 542 that says "Nothing now"?
Nothing now, not even the ocean, could be heard in the room, though the windows overlooked the long moon-stung waves. In the moonlight, against gravity, the thing poised there, faceless, armless, attending him, as if in a moment it would speak. In the curiously sealed quality of the silence in the room, they waited thus, the disquieted vectorist in this wraith of Pleiade La Frisee. Was it something he drank? Should he start conversing with the negligee?
Just that last line of "should he start conversing with a negligee" really killed me when I was reading
Yeah.
it the first time. And essentially, he goes back to his room and finds that Pleiade has been used as a distraction for someone to go through his things. And then we are treated to one of the most interesting back and forths in this chapter, but also I would say in this section of the book, in terms of kind of what it gets into. And I almost, if you guys want to indulge me, want to go through and read all of this dialogue on 543 through to the very top of 544.
Oh yeah, it's a fantastic scene.
Yeah, if we just want, I'll start with the intro paragraph, and then if we just want to do like a sequence of Cody, Luke, Will, just one sort of line or one paragraph at a time through to the end, I think that'd be great. To the distant pulse of the sea, among the tall-hatted monitory shadows, he made his way back to the hotel to find his bedroll gone through, though that couldn't have taken more than a minute, and his first thought was of Scarsdale Vibe, or a Vibe agent.
We saw them, said Eugene. It was the political police. They think you were one of us. Thanks to us, you are now a nihilist outlaw. It's okay, said Kit. It's something I was always planning to get around to anyway. Did any of them bother you folks?
We know each other, said Polycarp. It's a peculiar game we all play. Against what looms in the twilight of the European future, it doesn't make much sense, this pretending to carry on with the day, just waiting, everyone waiting.
In France, said Denis, they speak of he who must come. He is not the Messiah. He is not Christ or Napoleon returned. He was not General Boulanger. He is unnameable. Nevertheless, one would have to be uncommonly isolated, either mentally or physically, not to feel his approach, and to know what he is bringing, what death and what transfiguration.
We wait here, however, not like the French, for some Napoleon. Nothing that human, but kept hostage to the arrival of a certain military hour, when even the general staffs decide it has struck.
Isn't Belgium supposed to be neutral?
Zeker, a shrug. There's even a treaty, which makes it a dead cert. Will be invaded by at least one of the signatories. Isn't that what treaties of neutrality are for? Each of the powers has its plan for us. Von Schlieffen, for instance, wants to send in 32 German divisions against our own, let us say 6. Wilhelm has offered Leopold part of France, the ancient Duchy of Burgundy. If, when the mythical moment arrives, we will surrender all our famous shell-proof forts and leave the railways intact. Little Belgium once again busy at what she does best. Tamely offering her battlefield-ready lowlands to boots, hooves, iron wheels, waiting to be first to go under before a future no one in Europe has the clairvoyance to imagine as anything more than an exercise for clerks.
Think of Belgium as a pawn. It is no accident that so many international chess tournaments are held here in Ostend. If chess is war in miniature, perhaps Belgium is understood to be the first sacrifice in a general conflict, but perhaps not as in a gambit to provide a counterattack, for a gambit may be declined, and who would decline to take Belgium?
So, this is like Colorado with changes of sign, it's negative altitude, this living below sea level. Something like that?
Fatou stood close to him, looking up through her lashes. It is the sorrow of anticipation, Kit.
And so obviously we've said a couple of different times over the course of, I'd say, particularly the last like 200 pages of this book, that World War One looms very large over this novel, and that it was very clear that to any historian studying the period, that war was inevitable, that with the way these treaties, these alliances were being formed and the different ways in which they were shifting and changing and how they started to involve whole countries like the Ottoman Empire, began to indicate that this couldn't last. It was getting too complicated. The entropy was reaching sort of a fever pitch, and that something had to happen naturally as a consequence of that. And this is where World War One comes from. And it seems very clear that Pynchon is making an argument that if it could be felt that easily, then it must have been felt on the street level, that everyone knew that this sort of European experiment, so to speak, was about to get shaken up and right quick. And I think the way that that's rendered here is really beautiful. And it's been rendered this way in a couple of different formats and variations over the course of those last 200 pages, I would say. But this is one where it really goes down to the kind of individual human level in a way that I think is really successful. And it also is successful in a way of speaking to the devastation of World War One in a way where this conflict has gotten to such a massive size, and a massive inevitable size, I should probably say, that one whole country, Belgium, is just going to be offered up as a sacrifice to the trenches, which would become true. The massive trench network of World War One extended out to one sort of half of Belgium, I think the eastern half. And this whole country is going to be offered up to be stomped on by horse hooves and boots. But there is this like grand history to all of these things at this point, you know? And the inherent tragedy of that is really felt by the reader for me. That's certainly the biggest part of this discourse that stands out. Cody, I noticed in the photo you sent earlier you were complaining about the Pynchon wiki, but you annotated in your book the word Hitler next to the description of he who's to come.
Yes. That whole paragraph just reads as that incarnate evil that is kind of looming. And it's been, that's obviously been within the book for most of it, right? And it's really in most of Pynchon's works. There's always that sort of looming evil that presents itself and is just kind of there in a sort of Lovecraftian kind of way, I guess. And in this sense, it's there's always a manifestation of it, and I think this is a sort of portent of the coming of Hitler. World War One, for as bad as it was, really, if you're going to compare the devastation and the overall impact on a global scale, I think World War II was kind of the culmination of all of that. Like World War One obviously set the pieces in place for what came with World War II, but I think that was kind of like the ultimate evil, I think, that we've seen in history at this point. I mean, you could maybe go back to something like, like a Genghis Khan or somebody like that, but there's not as much documentation as far as what his reign of terror really, truly, we have evidence of it, obviously, but the horrors that Hitler brought about are so fresh and still lingering today, which is sad. But I think that's, I can't read a paragraph like that without thinking that's kind of what the finger is kind of pointing towards,
Any other thoughts we have on this discourse?
I do want to ask, am I the only one that keeps reading Denis' name as Dinas?
Yeah, I think I had to, in one of the earlier paragraphs, I had to say his name, and I almost said it like that.
I
And then I
keep
realized,
it
yeah,
constantly.
I'm not reading Inherent Vice, so I don't need to do that. But yeah, it did occur to me as well.
And to add some context for the curious listener who's wondering what the hell the picture I sent of the pinch on wiki was, I, I will preface this by saying the people who have edited the pinch on wiki, kudos to them for doing a lot of work, because it genuinely is a lot of work. That being said, the wiki for this book, and we have mentioned this several times before, is sometimes a bit much. And there is a note on page 543 that says, "Against the day, note this phrase happens at the exact halfway point of the novel." There are 20 words between against and the day. So no, that's not a thing. You can't do that. That's not how things like that work. I appreciate that you're trying to make this like grand connection, and it's just not there. So yeah, that just really bothered me.
And what's really funny about that, and like, I think what bothers me about it even more than the fact that obviously against the day as a phrase is said like in every single chapter of this book. It's like, yes, of course
Yes,
Pynchon's
yeah.
gonna put it in the middle. Like, okay, yes, I'm happy to point at the middle point of something and say, oh, this is, formally meaningful. But like, seriously, like again, literally every chapter so far has had multiple drops of the name. So it's one of those things where why are you stretching so hard? Especially when what y'all just talked about is clearly what is the centerpiece, not the fucking word against the
Yes.
day. It's the centerpiece is the presumption that there is this like anti-messiah on their path, that there is das Übermensch coming over the hillside. That's the thing that's in the middle of this book, not against the day.
He said the name of the book in the book.
Hey, that's the name of the show. Oh man. So all of this leads us to the mayonnaise works. To Midnight in the Mayonnaise Works. Which, if we had custom titles for each of these episodes,
Oh boy, you bet that would be it.
would have to be this one. Against the Day 38 to 39, Midnight in the Mayonnaise Works. It all leads us there. And this I sort of set the book down for a second in between fits of laughter, and I was like, why is this here? Why is it mayonnaise? What is he getting at? What's the purpose? And I think what he's getting at is what is mentioned here on 345. The sauce was invented as a new sensation for jaded palates at court by the Duc de Relichoux, at first known as Mahonnaise after Mahon, the the chief port of Minorca, the scene of the Duc's dubious victory in 1756 over the ill-fated Admiral Byng. Basically, Louis' drug dealer and pimp Richelieu, known for opium recipes to fit all occasions, is also credited with the introduction to France of the cantharides or Spanish fly. So I thought, that's a lot of detail to throw out about the inventor of mayonnaise, and not even really the inventor of mayonnaise, but the man who got mayonnaise delivered to him for the first time in history.
Guy who was like, "Hey, y'all ought to try this."
And so I started by looking into him in particular, and then eventually getting to the other name that's given here, John Byng, is I believe how that's going to be pronounced. And that's where something really started to emerge for me. The Duc here is the third Duc of Relichoux, and it is Armand de Vignereau du Plessis, I'm going to guess is how that's pronounced. He was the third Duke and would eventually become the Marshal of France after joining the army and participating in 3 wars. He was known as a man of loose morals. He actually served 3 stints in the Bastille, and one was just because his dad thought it would be good for him, which is the craziest thing I've ever heard. Another one was a responsibility over a duel, and I think the third one was for theft. So it was just appeared to be a menace of Parisian society at the time. He was also a womanizer. He was married to 3 women, and I believe one of the 3 women he was married to was like 85. So really had an incredibly bizarre history of romantic connections as well. He was also openly considered to be of limited intelligence because of his low education and his general behavior, but he continued to rise above his station higher and higher because he was like passably good in the military. And so eventually he actually would become the ambassador to the court of the Holy Roman Empire from 1725 to 1729. And all of this is, of course, explained by the fact that he was the godson to Louis XIV, so he was a Nepo baby. He was so annoying, in fact, that Marie Antoinette banned him from court after she came into power because she was not interested in hearing from him ever. So that's one half of this equation. That's the mayonnaise guy. In the reference that we get... In the reference to history that we get there, we also get John Byng, as I mentioned. And this one's crazy. He was a British admiral who had served with distinction until falling in battle to the Duc de Richelieu, the guy I just talked about, at the Battle of Minorca. On the approach of the 7 Years' War, which I don't have time to explain, the best way that I could probably put it in terms of its relevance to Against the Day is that it is effectively World War I before World War I in terms of why the individual causes of it happened. It had a lot to do with treaties and people getting pulled into stuff they didn't want to be pulled into. It had to do a lot with sort of like losing face territorially, colonial projects. It almost feels like a trial run of World War I in terms of how the elements of the upper echelon of society led to this multi-continental breakout of war for ostensibly private interests. But the idea of a private interest wasn't as much of a codified thing then. That's the best that I'm going to be able to give you right now. So on the approach of the 7 Years' War, which is a conflict in the 1700s, John Byng was ordered to raise a fleet that had been completely depleted of its resources and was unarmed. So at this time in the Admiralty's history, the Admiralty had been actively not keeping track of its fleet very well in terms of maintenance and resupplying and weaponry sort of replacement. It was in shambles. And as the British Empire's trade interests in the Mediterranean, speaking of the Odyssey, began to get threatened by one of the alliances that involved France during the lead up to the 7 Years' War, they decided that it was probably going to be a good idea if they sent some ships down there. So they picked this admiral who's pretty good at his job, and they ask him to go raise a specific fleet of ships. And when he gets there, the place is trashed. The shipyards are barely functional. The ships themselves are severely depleted in terms of crew, in terms of munitions, supplies. There are reports of like some of the like central masts of these boats being broken that he was expected to sail out on to meet the French Armada in the 1700s. And he writes to the Admiralty and he basically says like, hey, these ships are destroyed. There is nothing that I can do with them. And it's going to cost a lot of money for us to A, get them fixed enough to sail into sort of ship to ship combat, but also B, even more money to make them actually functional beyond the necessity. And the Admiralty writes him back and basically says like, you have a month and here's a very Peasley sum of money. He then does what he can in that month. He writes them again and he's like, I need more money and we also frankly need more time. And they go, we don't have either. We're not going to give you any money. Sail up to Portsmouth for your final resupply, and then you are ordered to go into the Mediterranean and into Minorca. And so he does as he's told. He sails up to Portsmouth. They launch, and immediately there are problems. Like this is such a shambolic fleet of ships that he's been given control over that it is estimated that he was as potentially understaffed with a shortage of men in the 800s, that's every ship that's being affected at that point in history to a significant degree. If you are lacking 800 sailors and men to operate your armada. So he goes down there and he needs to try and resupply midway between where he's at and where he's going, so he stops in Gibraltar. And when he stops there, the Admiralty's vessels and repair facilities and docks are just as trashed as the ones in England. There is still nothing there. And so he decides that he is going to send a request to the Admiralty for more resources. And before they can answer, the British administration on Gibraltar at the docks holds a war council and then refuses to give him anything. They basically just for some reason say, nope, fuck you, not interested. And so the Marine force that he was supposed to have been supplied with when he arrived didn't get on the boats. So they are well and truly fucked at this point, but they have no choice in their minds, so they go anyway. And they go down into Minorca, and he would meet a force of over 15,000 French troops between the naval officers and the sailors and the Marines, and over 1,000 ships are waiting for him when he gets there. And he is left with a severely depleted, undermanned, ramshackle force of boats to meet them. But he's doing his job, so everything gets lined up. People are aware that this is going to happen, and the next day, the battle does happen. It's a massacre. He's somehow able to sort of hold his own in the sense that he didn't lose any boats, but there is no path to victory here. And eventually, their battle lines are broken, and it takes almost an hour for them to manage to sail and reform them. But by this point, the French are so sort of overpowering of them that they sort of have no chance anyway. And because of the fact that this was not going to escalate into a full-on war yet, the 7 Years' War was still a little bit of a ways away. The French also declined to kind of massacre them there, like actually kill them, destroy the boats. It seemed that they just kind of said, we've demonstrated our power of our navy to you. You have lost this bad. We're just going to go away. And by the time the British forces had realigned, I guess the winds had changed, and it would have put them in a position where those few boats that he had could sneak up behind the French and unlaunch, release or launch a barrage of cannon fire at them to potentially win. And this is suggested by his chief captain, and this admiral basically says, nope, we're gonna go home. There's no point in us doing this. It's not gonna be worth anything. And so they repair their ships while they're waiting there. They wait another 4 days to see if the French get back. They don't. That means they've sailed on, so they decide to make their way home. And the admiral stops back in Gibraltar for repairs, and he declines to tell the Admiralty what happened. He decides that he's just going to go back home, that the mission must be completed because the French are no longer encroaching on the territory, and we've sort of done our job. This was the wrong choice because the Duke, the mayonnaise man, as I've called him, when he gets back to France, he feels like gloating a little bit. And so he sends a letter to the Admiralty saying, oh, you have no idea of the victory I have had over your forces, or something like that. I don't know. And effectively begins spreading propaganda within the Admiralty because they have nothing else to compare this to. Their admiral never wrote them back. And so when they arrive in Gibraltar, the admiral is immediately arrested and relieved of duty when he was supposed to be resupplied. Here's where it gets into like historical conspiracy corner. Insert bumper here.
Электромузыкальный инструмент терминвокс – это первый инструмент такого типа.
There was basically a memo or a after action report that is supposed to have been written by John Byng that was published in the London Gazette. But in actuality, it is a reworking of a statement he gave to someone else that is heavily edited, sentences are rearranged, and the sentiment is changed to imply that he was a coward. And this newspaper runs it on the front page in full. And suddenly, there is such a public outcry over the humiliation at Minorca that the kind of regular person in England is burning effigies of Admiral John Byng in the streets and calling for his punishment. But this whole thing was made up. And as we'll see when we get to the end of the story, it was probably made up by the Admiralty to blame someone else on their poor lack of maintenance of their fleet. They were just going to hang this guy out to dry. And so when he gets back to England, he's immediately court-martialed. The trial takes a week, and he is accused of breaching the Articles of War in reference to, quote, not doing his utmost against the enemy, which had been made a capital offense. It wasn't a week, it was 4 weeks. After his 4-week trial, Byng was acquitted of personal cowardice, but was found guilty of not doing his utmost against the enemy. The Lord Commissioner of the Admiralty refused to sign the death warrant, publishing a rebuttal in the local newspaper and sending an official appeal for clemency to George II. The king refused, so the members of the court-martial appealed to Parliament seeking to speak on Byng's behalf. The proposal was refused in Parliament. The Secretary of State for the Southern Department was aware that the Admiralty was practically at fault for the loss due to their lack of fleet maintenance. But the Duke of Newcastle, who was the official political person to blame for the lack of maintenance, was in a political coalition with the Secretary, so the Secretary could not force an appeal for clemency through to the House of Parliament because it would directly break his recently formed political alliance. So what he does instead is he individually writes to King George II and asks him to give clemency to Admiral Byng. And the king says no. And the reason he says no is because he is a political rival with the secretary over a dispute from the previous year about the secretary advocating for reduced powers for the monarchy in like a particular legal arena. And so he says no over this guy's life simply because they're rivals. By now, it has reached the general public that there is a suspicion of the Admiralty having brought the charges against Byng because they sought political cover for their mismanagement of their general sort of fleet. How that leaked into the public, people are not aware, but at this point, the sentiment towards Byng has flipped. Now the public wants him to be spared, when before they wanted him to be killed. By this time, the Secretary of the Southern Department was also the leader of the House of Commons. He had risen in political stature. So he appeals to King George II again, saying, "The House of Commons, sir, is inclined to mercy." And the king replied to him, "You have taught me to look for the sense of my people elsewhere than in the House of Commons." So 4 months after his court-martial ends, Byng is executed in the presence of all of his men and all of his men and boats in the other ships in his fleet. They're all forced to watch. The execution would be satirized by Voltaire in Candide, where he says, upon witnessing the execution of an admiral, Candide is told by a bystander, "In this country, it is good to kill an admiral from time to time to encourage the others." He was the last man to be executed in this fashion, and 22 years later, the Articles of War would be amended to make other punishments than death viable. In 2007, the descendants of the admiral petitioned the government for a posthumous pardon. The Ministry of Defense refused. And it has, in history now, been called the worst legalistic crime in the nation's annals. Now, why do I feel like that's important? Because we already talked about the sense of kind of inevitability that exists there, and inevitability in the face of something nonsensical, in effect. And that is certainly what I see in this story with Admiral John Byng, in that it is inevitable that he is going to be killed, but he is going to be killed for no reason at all, because some people were playing political hot potato with money and resources, and it blew up in their face. And you know what else that sounds like? That also sounds like World War I. And so I feel like what Pynchon is indicating here is that these struggles between political powers, private interests, and these different treaties and agreements and alliances that led to the breakout of World War II ended up just killing a regular person. And in this story, this like Kafkaesque nightmare of bureaucracy that Admiral John Byng was forced to be in, he is that ordinary person being killed by World War I. And I think it's such a genius thing. I could be out of my mind right now as far as why this is included in the text, because I spent 3 hours reading about the court case and the court martial and all this stuff. But it feels too resonant to how the power structures of the time were just taking complete advantage of the human resources of their country towards ultimately stupid self-serving ends than a story like this. And it was another one of these moments where, like, I was frustrated, I wanted to throw the book out the window, but also I was incredibly glad that it was there, and then I read it because this book, I think, more successfully communicates an encyclopedic world than Gravity's Rainbow does. In how I genuinely feel as though I have an understanding of this period of history through the lens that Pynchon wants me to. And it is these little asides that have really delivered on his need for proof that his argument about World War I and that his argument about the collapse of that old world that he's writing about is supported through the true facts of these individual people or factions that he is commenting on. Yeah, it's just an incredible thing to include in a fucking joke about mayonnaise.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
When I was reading the scene, I was like, Kate's going to go on a real good deep dive about like the Duke of Richelieu and pull up all this really cool information that's going to like really set the tone and help understand what Pynchon was getting at and how this all ties back into World War I and the global situation that was going on at the time. So I'm going to use my time to learn about mayonnaise and the history of mayonnaise. And let me tell you, I had a good time. It is wild. It's not nearly as wild as Duke Richelieu and his old buddy Byng. But I did learn that there is mayonnaise is the base for so many other things, and they have such good names. One of which is salsa golf, and it's it's a cold sauce common in Argentina. It's made of mayonnaise base with like ketchup and cumin, oregano. Like they put all these like herbs and stuff in it. And then there's also one that's in the Midwest U.S. that's called comeback sauce. And it's basically just mayonnaise and like spices. So, yeah. That was what I learned about.
I live in the Midwest U.S. I have my entire life. I've never heard of comeback sauce.
Neither have I. I've lived in all my time in this world. I've never heard of that or salsa golf. Now I have. But no, to your point, it is, yeah. I think that's one of my favorite things about Pynchon is his ability to bury all this this really fascinating and genuinely interesting history just under the surface of what's going on in the story, right? Like it's not so much that you have to go and like really dig through the text to find what it is he's getting. It's all there. You just have to be willing to do the legwork to go and learn about all the little pieces that come in to make this whole thing really come into focus. And it's astonishing because he's doing all of this probably without the internet, to be honest. Like, or maybe a very, very early iteration of it in like the late 90s as he was finishing it up. But most of the research for this book would have probably been just from the library and going to bookstores and finding, historical fiction or historical nonfiction that covered a lot of this stuff and then spinning it off into his own little thing. And it's insane.
All right. So Kit, for some reason, decides to follow her into the mustard works, into the mayonnaise works the next evening. She's not there. He got tricked again. And the description of the mayonnaise works is hilarious. I absolutely love the paragraph. The paragraphs that go over the description of it. It would require us to read like 2 pages, but it is one of my favorite things, and it really evokes that sort of scene in a movie where someone is wandering through an empty warehouse or an empty factory of some kind, and it's just a trap, and you just know that it's a trap.
Mm-hmm. It's a James Bond thing. Like I can't get that out of my head now. It is a James Bond moment.
I think Luke definitely hit the nail on the head with the Bond girl comparison. And they try to drown him in mayonnaise. And he narrowly escapes. I love the detail that when he tries to open the door, the mayonnaise is too thick for him to be able to actually fully move the door. It's so absurd.
I have to say my favorite line in all of this, because all 2 pages of this are brilliant, but it's on 546. Where it says he felt something heavy and wet in his hair. Mayonnaise. He's like, it's so good.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
It's very slapstick.
And then the fact that the 2 Italians are there and are kind of the perpetrators of it all, and they keep referring to him as cowboy.
Oh yeah, it's real good. And they sort of fly off into the sunset, so to speak, having narrowly avoided their fate. Do we have any additional things we want to add onto the mayonnaise works and the end of the chapter?
I'd like to just point out, just to make it painfully clear, that mayonnaise, if you've never made it yourself, it's kind of one of those things that I think prior to specifically this moment in history that the book is set, it might be a little bit like, I don't know, the idea that you would always need an accountant in your business, right? You can't just have a spreadsheet that totals the numbers yourself. You need a person checking over the boxes and doing all those things. You need someone to whisk the mayonnaise just right, because it's quite tricky if you're not an expert. Making mayonnaise is not an easy thing to do. There's a reason that there are so many myths around how to fix a broken mayonnaise, or what kinds of random events will cause them. You kind of need an excuse for your broken mayo in the pre-modern times. And this is kind of, very simply, it's haute cuisine, it's high culture being taken and turned into a mass-produced form of profiteering. Just to underline that once again.
Yeah, it's a great connection, Will.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I would be remiss if I did not ask you all a question that I forgot to ask when we were covering 539.
Mm-hmm.
But when Dr. Ganesh is introduced, it says here, and considered subjectively, added Dr. V. Ganesh Rao of the Calcutta University, an active becoming longer or shorter, while at the same time turning, among axes whose unit vector is not the familiar and comforting 1, but the altogether disquieting square root of -1. If you were a vector, mademoiselle, you would begin in the real world, change your length, enter an imaginary reference system, rotate up to 3 different ways, and then return to reality as a new person or vector. Is that what happened to the Chums of Chance at Candlebrow in that whole fucked up sequence from like 100 pages ago?
Trying to think of how to answer this question. It'll be, you'll learn more that either confirms or does not confirm that hypothesis later on.
Okay.
But you are onto something. And that is a very good part that I don't know how we skipped over that. That's yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I'll keep my emotions intact until we get to a further part of the book.
Stop asking so many good questions.
This is the danger of doing a podcast on a book you've never read before.
Yeah.
So 39 brings us back out to the Chums of Chance, who have been ordered to Brussels to pay their respects at a memorial service for General Boulanger, held each September 30th on the anniversary of his suicide, an observance not altogether free of political suggestion, there having remained within the Chums of Chance bureaucracy a defiant residue of Boulangism. Official correspondence from the French chapters, for example, could still be found bearing yellow and blue postage stamps, with the general's likeness printed in a sorrowful brown, all to appearances legitimate French issues, ranging from 1 centime to 20 francs. But in reality, timbres factifs, said to be of the German origin. The work of an entrepreneur who hoped to sell them after a boulangist coup, though sinister hints were also in the air of involvement by 3B, the intelligence bureau of the German general staff, reflecting a theory thereamong that Germany might stand a better military chance against a revanchist effort led by somewhat discomposed general than any policy perhaps a bit more thought out. So, here's the part where I was like, oh, fuck off. I can't keep doing this forever.
Is it timbres fictifs?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I figured.
There is a reference here to General Boulanger, the person that the Chums of Chance are sent to attend the vigil of. He was a populist political figure who rose to prominence as the Minister of War in France. His full name was Georges Ernest Boulanger, is my best guess as to how that's pronounced. When he was Minister of War, he made reforms to benefit soldiers, one of which was that he started letting them grow a beard. He advocated for revenge on Germany by the French military, quelled a workers' strike in Decazeville, and pushed for adoption of new military technology to make like bullets and rifles more efficient. He would be retained to the War Office in order to try and provoke the Germans when a new Prime Minister of France took power. And to do so, he built military facilities in border towns. He banned the export of horses to Germany. And he also went so far as to ban presentations of Wagner operas that would be produced and performed in France. Germany responded to all of this by calling 70,000 reservists up in response to a newspaper article that claimed a mid-level police inspector was arrested by 2 officers of the German secret police. This was true, and the police inspector was released a week later. But the rhetoric from both sides being launched at one another over the arrest of this one man rose to such a fever pitch that it appeared war was possible. What the cause of the arrest was has never been known, and theories have changed over the years. But now, one of the prevailing theories is that he was engaged in espionage on behalf of Boulanger and had gone into Germany to meet up with his German counterpart that was going to like give him intel or share information with him. And what led to his arrest was like a dispute over whether or not he had illegally entered Germany, essentially. And so effectively, the whole incident led to the ousting of the prime minister, who was then responsible. His association with Boulanger was then responsible for Boulanger being fired. So essentially, this whole like fever pitch to like work up towards war led to the prime minister losing the office within a year. And then when the new prime minister came in, he fired Boulanger for his sort of attempts to rile up the Germans into an armed conflict. Boulanger would turn towards the political arena again, though, when he suddenly, out of nowhere, got 100,000 votes for an election in the Seine that he was not a candidate for. In response to this, there was a fear from some of the French conservatives that sort of a fervor was growing around this one person, and so they decided to reassign him militarily out into the French countryside, so he couldn't be close enough to the centers of power to continue to be present in the public consciousness. However, when they tried to send him out of the city and out to his new post, a crowd of 10,000 people occupied the Gare de Lyon, which would have been the train station that he left to go out into the countryside on. And they all stood on the tracks so the train couldn't leave, chanting, "He will return," over and over again. And he had to be smuggled out of the city because they were so persistent that no trains were able to leave the station at all. So he decided that once he had been reassigned and he had this opportunity to kind of actually put his newfound political power into practice, he decided to create a new party. And his party was based on 3 central tenets: revision of the Constitution, revenge on Germany, and restoration of the monarchy. Despite his belief that it was a critique of the conservative party that had been leading France at the time, it was actually a lot of leading conservatives who joined his movement immediately. After a scandal involving the godson of the current president of France selling Legion of Honor medals to people, there was a lot of sentiment against the conservative movement in the country, and this led to the Boulangist movement growing. A bunch of people started joining the party because if it is this nakedly corrupt, then the guy they want to get rid of must be sort of against this establishment. So this populist movement begins to grow around the guy. And a lot of people are asking him to put forth his name as a candidate for any sort of regional administration posts. And instead of doing that, though, he basically just says, "I will throw my party's support behind any prime minister candidate who is willing to make me the war minister." None of them do, because it is very evident that would be suicidal of the country to engage in. And so he misses out on this first attempt at gaining real power. And the Bonapartists would join his party at this point. So he was seeking support from other people and found that the Bonapartists were willing to join in. And after that happened, he gets expelled from the army. And by this point, it's May of 1888. And only a day later, Daniel Wilson, the relative of the of the president who was selling medals from his position in the army, is released from prison. So this increases the popularity of Boulanger even more, because he's being expelled from the army for BS reasons, and this corrupt politician's kid or relative is being released from prison the day after. In 1888, he would run with the Bonapartist backing of his party for 7 departments in France. Basically, those are appointments to the administrative regions of France and the government of those administrations. And 7 other departments had representatives of his party run in elections as well. By the time the elections were finished, both he and many of his supporters were sworn in to several different posts across the country and at levels of government, but they failed to gain a majority in the chamber and so could not pass legislation. They were this very minority party within the parliamentary system there. He would eventually resign his seat in the assembly in protest of the reception given to his policies. So he effectively had a temper tantrum. But as soon as he did that, he would become this icon of Parisian society. At this point, they really wanted to push for him to get back into politics effectively. And they actually started making little sort of like trinkets out of his black horse as a method of showing that they were supporters of this particular guy. He had like iconography associated with him. You maybe can see where this is going. And At this point, there was a push for him to try to run for president, which he accepted that he would be willing to do, but it lost him the conservative backers who thought that he would eventually become a military dictator if he actually was elected president. In 1889, he won an election for the deputy of Paris, and everything was primed for a coup d'état. Historians now say that like if Boulanger wanted to grab hold of France, he could have done it right here. And he was really sort of racked with indecision and procrastination. And so his opportunity passed. They say by the 27th of January of 1889, it was too close to, or it was too far away. He'd waited too long for this to be successful. So he chose to contest power legally, but in his methodology utilized for contesting power, it gave his enemies a chance to respond to the fact that it now seemed likely that he was going to try and pull a coup d'etat at some point. And so what they did is they issued a warrant for his arrest for conspiracy and for treason, and they would do the same thing with his top aides and party members. To the astonishment of his supporters, he chose to flee to Brussels instead of fighting the charges, which caused the movement to die. His party was defeated in the July 1889 general election so completely that the entire political movement was destroyed. And then he would kill himself in 1891, just before this book starts, on the grave of his mistress. Many modern scholars see Boulangism as a proto-fascist movement, and there is certainly a similarity between Boulanger and Mussolini in terms of their political trajectories and rises to power. Only the thing that really separates them is at that moment where Boulanger hesitates, Mussolini doesn't. Mussolini does the coup, takes power, and then allows the sort of fear that he has built into the kind of system there in Italy to not challenge him, even though they legally could. And would they be killed? Yeah, probably. But that would have changed the way that Mussolini came to power. Many scholars also say that he was a right-wing leader and that his movement was right-wing, but a lot of French scholars in particular disagree with that and say that the movement began as a coalescing of the fragmented extreme leftist groups in the country. And this is because the right wing in France was always devoted to the Catholic Church and to the nobility, and Boulangists, as populists, were not. Ironically, many of his supporters would end up forming the radical right about a decade after the Dreyfus era, or a decade after this Boulangist era during the Dreyfus era. So the people that he allied to his cause, even if he started from a leftist perspective, he pushed into the right through the way that this movement went, which certainly adds more to its sort of proto-fascist bona fides. Do we have anything we want to add to that before I get to 3B? Because I think that it is very evident that the Chums being forced to attend this sort of vigil says a lot about the organization they work for, and certainly why the organization they work for has these kind of like sinister undertones, or maybe overtones at this point, that seem to be getting worse.
I will say I do want to point out at the top of 549 there's a little quote from Randolph here where he says, once Randolph with a long accustomed melancholy, they would have all been stopped in their tracks, rubbernecking up at us in wonder. Nowadays we just grow more and more invisible. Given the timing of this point in the book and the coming events, the looming sort of danger and terror that's right on the precipice of the world stage, I think this is a really interesting sort of meta commentary that Randolph is making about the nature of sci-fi fantasy literature specifically, and how its usefulness as an escape tool has its limitations, and those limitations are often tested. And this is a good example of it, when the reality of the world in which you live starts to subsume your ability to escape that through art in general. It can, for a lot of people, kind of suck the life out of and the joy out of that art, and the ability to enjoy it goes away as a result. And I think that's kind of what he's getting at here, is saying like at some point we stop being that thing that people look up in the sky to be awed and wondered by, because what's going on at eye level is way too much for them to look away from at any moment.
Yeah, I think that's great stuff. Absolutely.
Which is of course followed by Lindsay being a dick,
Yes.
literally and figuratively.
Yeah. The last historical note I have, and then I promise I'm able to shut up on these tangents, is that those sinister hints also in the air of involvement by 3B. This is a reference to Abteilung 3B, a domestic counterintelligence branch of the German army from 1889 to 1918. Its counterintelligence efforts were focused on the French Third Republic and the Russian Empire, but during World War I, they were expanded their responsibilities into media censorship and the production of propaganda. World War I also crucially killed their foreign network, and so as a result, they couldn't continue to do what they had previously been doing, and instead decided to be certified for domestic spying instead. So during World War I, AB3 starts spying on Germany, and their leader, a man by the name of Colonel Walter Nicolai, was responsible for turning 3B into an ultra-nationalist organization. So much so that left-wing newspapers in Germany at the time would refer to him as the father of lies. By the time the war ended, 3B agents had actually been exposed in places as far away as Mexico, Argentina, and the United States. So even though some of their foreign operations, especially in the mainland continent, evaporated, they were able to expand well beyond that. Here's where it gets weird. Walter Nicolai would later found the German Fatherland Party in 1917, and that would become significant as the first attempt to unite the militant nationalists of the interwar period with the traditional right wing in Germany. Anton Drexler was a member of the German Fatherland Party. And Anton Drexler is important because he would then go on to form the German Workers' Party, otherwise known as the Nazis. Upon their decline, the party was then folded into the German National People's Party, the major nationalist party of the Weimar Republic. And Alfred Hugenberg was the leader of the German National People's Party at that time. He was not only familiar with the German Fatherland Party, but he was also familiar with their leader, Colonel Walter Nicolai, because Alfred Hugenberg worked with 3B on the production of political propaganda during World War I, and had then gone on to be the largest media proprietor in Germany through a publishing empire. By 1920, there was no one bigger producing German media than he was. As Hitler was becoming increasingly powerful in his political stature, especially within the German Workers' Party, Hugenberg realized that the power that they had managed to seize was threatened by the rising voice of Hitler. And so he decided to help Hitler into power by essentially brokering a truce between the leadership of his party and Hitler, by way of telling, he was essentially the first person in quite a long list of people who said, if we just appease Hitler, it won't be so bad, is essentially what he did as a way to convince his party that they should kind of like let him campaign for chancellor. And so it's really interesting how that was sort of the excuse all the way down with Hitler, all the way up until the kind of explosion of World War II. And in response to that, Hitler gave him a cabinet post. He accepted the cabinet post because he thought that from his role as Reich Minister of Economics and Agriculture, that he could essentially puppet Hitler. He was wrong. And every opportunity he tried to puppet Hitler, Hitler would see what he was doing and rebuff it. And so what started to be built, especially as he would advocate for some less outwardly aggressive policies. He was all in on the dictatorship. He was a uniparty or a party of one guy himself. but especially as the sort of aggression started to turn outwards from Germany, he started to get a bit more vocal, and so like a whisper campaign to remove him got started, and Hitler not only removed him, but also removed the entirety of his party from the Reichstag. And what's even crazier is when they burned the Reichstag before he was ousted. The politics of Nazi Germany are very complicated. They burned the Reichstag. They held a new Reichstag election. The Reichstag really didn't do anything. They were there, but it was really just a rubber stamp that didn't even meet in person to stamp anything for Hitler. And they very rarely met. So even after the Reichstag, there was a place for them to exile Hugenberg too. But when they burned the Reichstag and blamed it on the communists, Hugenberg was like a major vocal supportive person for that theory. So this man carried water for Hitler for a very long time. And in the kind of ultimate irony of not just this man's life, but then also Pynchon's mention of it here is the newspaper and the telecommunications network he had, that he gained prominence through the support of 3B to publish propaganda, that would later be nationalized through the Nazis into the propaganda ministry, and then merged with the German news network and news office. So all of that was gone and subsumed by like the monster that his actions all the way back to 3B and forward helped create. And I think, again, if we're looking at like, this is crazy shit that I'm about to say, but if we're looking at this as the pivotal like center point of the book, that things start to radiate outwards that have been radiating towards the center, it's interesting that this guy at the center of his life built this media empire off the back of proto-fascist money, and then towards the end of his life and towards the end of his kind of dealings with the Nazis and all of the things that he would go on to do with that publishing empire was destroyed by the movement that he created. I don't think that has anything to do with it being in the center of the book, but it's just a thought that I had just now that I figured out throughout there. But again, another instance of like, this proto-fascist stuff was in the air. It was coming, even if it wasn't going to be World War I. Something bad was happening, and I think that there's some of this is being articulated in these pages in an effort to showcase that World War I was the spark for something much darker and much deeper and evil, even as it was built off of and sort of fueled by a different type of evil in a really interesting way. And the way that Pynchon is nesting this stuff together, putting the 3B right next to the Boulanger, the person who is, Mussolini is the father of fascism, but Boulanger is effectively the grandfather of fascism, is really, really smart writing and really smart sort of book construction, in my opinion.
I just want to say that it can't be the center of the book because it doesn't say against the day.
You're right. Foolish.
So
Foolish.
all of your research is for naught.
I'm going to throw my notebook away.
Have you considered it's not just an extended pun on Baker?
That is always possible.
It doesn't go anywhere. But instead of all of that research and like the thematic correlations that you've presented to us so relatively cleanly, given the breadth of the subject matter, could it just be a funny idea of Bakerism?
I mean, with Pynchon, yeah, that's always possible.
Yeah, anything is possible.
Just needed to be said, I guess.
So from there is a intruder who shows up in the city of Ostend, where the Chums of Chance are, as well as the Quaternionists, and it is clear that they have been recognized, and that's all of the sort of trappings of these guys showing up have happened here. The strange messages going into the Tesla device, and there's still this talk of the Quaternion weapon seemingly traveling around everywhere where these folks have been. And what do you guys make of the line on 549 where it says Hoover couldn't always see the skyship, but he knew it was there? This sort of tacit implication of the Chums of Chance being real, affecting events again, is it made to intuit the idea that Hoover's working for the Chums of Chance? What did you guys make of that inclusion?
I kind of tie it back to what I had mentioned earlier about them and their role in not only in the story but in the real world in which it takes place. That their presence is sort of waning at this point because of everything that's going on. It's taking away people's ability to engage with that kind of art. And that being said, though, it was for certain people, they are always that idea that escape is always still there. And I think that's the case with Hoover, is that he might not be able to see them as well as he once did, because that magic and that mysticism is evaporating as the grip of reality starts to really tighten around the world at the time. But he still has that ability to understand that they're always still with him. So it kind of goes back to that idea that they're physical and incorporeal at the same time, that I brought up earlier, where they exist on the page and in the real world. So when they can't be in one, they can still be in the other.
I think that makes a lot of sense. The way I kind of took it was more about like in these kind of broad stroke thematic senses that like the Chums of Chance are literally called the Chums of Chance, and they take a literal bird's eye view. And if they are diminishing in power, then I suppose it's, it's like metaphorically speaking, it is as though the things which previously could only be viewed as divinable through the eyes of God are being resected into these more bureaucratic and like transactional human scale events. I don't think these contradict each other at all, but
Makes sense. And it
I do
does.
think.
Go ahead,
No,
Luke.
go ahead, Kate.
No, go
You
ahead.
can go ahead. Okay, I do think that there's an element of like Wouvre, or however you say his name, being like aware of the fact that, like, I mean, historically, airships and like balloons and that type of stuff were used in warfare. A lot of it was like reconnaissance and stuff like that, where, and the Chums themselves have been used for that kind of stuff, more on like the spy side than on the literal like warfare and that kind of stuff side. But I mean, I do think that that's one of the reasons that he is perhaps focusing on it. And is perhaps, I think it's implied at least, that he's paranoid about them being around. Is just that, I mean, he doesn't know who they're working for, and at that time, if there was an airship hanging around observing things. Although I don't know. I mean, are they? I guess I can't really. I kind of forget if the Chums are on the airship, because they go into the town, I think, right? But I just think that there's an element of him just being aware of a rival, I guess, is what I'm getting at. A possible rival.
It also seems to be supporting the overall kind of idea of the barrier thinning, like the barrier between reality, as Cody had mentioned, which really brings up to mind like this idea of, again, bilocations, the barrier between objects thinning, breaking, parallel beings or parallel worlds, the layers between them breaking and merging, the old world and the new world, the barrier between those breaking and merging into one. Like this is something that keeps getting referenced a lot in these chapters, that there's a devolution associated to that, and it's manifesting in all these different kind of evil ways. And maybe, I don't know, here's a random big brain thought. Maybe the two worlds that are laid over top of one another using the Iceland spar and all the stuff that we talked about in the last section of the book. Maybe that's the future world that the intruders are coming from, where World War I has happened, and the past world where it didn't. Just a random thought. Anyway,
Yeah.
Another instance of this is the fact that Pugnax has developed a taste for human flesh, and that the relationship between Pugnax, the animal on board, and the people on board is also sort of thinning and breaking, and there's only one of them left who really spends any time with Pugnax. I wanted to ask you guys similarly what you thought of that inclusion, because it feels important.
So I hate to be the pedantic one here. It is a craving for blood that he has, not flesh.
Fair.
I
Dracula.
think it's a Dracula thing. I think because especially there he mentions the Carpathians, which is where Dracula is set. Bram Stoker's at least. So is there more? Is there a deeper layer to that? Probably, but my kind of knee jerk reaction to that is that it's just a fun little Dracula kind of thing, especially considering the I mean, it ties in with the looming evil and all that. And in a larger scale, you could look at the parasitic, blood sucking sort of nature of Dracula as comparable to the blood sucking and the soul crushing nature of capitalism as it was and what it led to and all that. You could mine a lot out of it. I just like to think of it as a fun little Dracula thing.
I guess I would say that as much as it is just a fun little Dracula thing.
Dracula.
We're getting Medea. Apparently, the I think another layer to that is that he is their security apparatus. He is both their he is their defense system and their like surveillance system. So and he is paralleling the way that Wufa is one of these people bleeding the multiple states of the European powers. Maybe not dry, but bleeding them. He that's Pugnax's job too, is to keep an eye on things, right? Even though it's just a boat, a sky boat. But hey,
Great point. Great point.
Mhm.
We are then treated to some lovely prose that leads to Miles explaining that he has requested special sky detail to take a moment to meet and speak with Ryder Thorne, who had been at Candlebrow and was in a ukulele workshop the same summer that Miles was. And we are treated to the conversation with the two of them, in which it becomes clear that what these strangers are here to warn against is World War One. It is the coming devastation. It is the fact that the world that they are traveling from can maybe be stopped from coming to fruition here. The D-Gay can be rebuilt, and that Miles has a sarcastic attitude towards his request, but it's also clear that he just does not know what they're talking about. And there seems to be a disagreement over whether or not Miles does really know what they're talking about and is just playing dumb or is not doing all that they can. And we certainly understand that there are things that the chums have been up to that like we have not read on the page. I mean, there's a reference here to the Carpathian stuff with Pugnax as evidence of that. That time passes and they do other things. Everything that is happening on the page isn't everything that's happening to them. So we don't know for sure, but it's clear that the intruders are not going to get anywhere with the Chums of Chance. And it's an impressive conversation between the two of them because like it is effectively a Star Wars style hologram talking to a fictional real boy, is I guess the way that I'm gonna put the Chums of Chance. And they're talking about things that are inherently sort of science fiction based or silly and time travel and trying to change the past to prevent the future and the paradoxical nature of that. But it is ultimately once again about bringing forth the human toll of something like World War I to the forefront and bringing forth the human toll of these. He's using these science fiction sort of trappings of storytelling to achieve an ultimately very humanistic end in a way that I find very impressive and just exceedingly well written. Like the hologram almost has, you can like sense the tiredness in that character and the just sort of world weary nature of what he's been through and what he's trying to articulate.
Yeah.
And it's great. It's a perfect end, I think, to this set of chapters, and it makes sense why chapter 39 is essentially just this conversation.
Yeah, I could go on and on about this chapter and especially this scene. So I want to back up real quick to point out that prior to this conversation between Miles and Ryder, it's pointed out that Miles is the only member of the crew who can communicate with Pugnax and has developed a sort of telepathic contact, which goes back towards the beginning of the story when he was at the helm, not at the helm, but he was on the ship and he was messing with the radio device when it got hit by lightning, and that had an effect on him. That was kind of what was being set up there. So now he has this ability to communicate with Ryder, and no one else has achieved this yet. But before I even get into that, there's on 551. I just wanted to read this part here. For somehow the earlier the great light had departed, the certitude become broken as ground dwellers' promises. Time regained its opacity, and one day the boys, translated here to Belgium, as if by evil agency, had begun to lapse earthward through a smell of coal smoke and flowers out of season, toward a beleaguered coast ambiguous as to the disposition of land and sea, down into seaside shadows stretching into the growing dark, shadows that could not always be correlated with actual standing architecture, folding and pleating ever inwardly upon themselves, an entire map full of unlighted outer neighborhoods sprawled among the dunes and small villages. The contrast between that description of their landing and the earlier instances in which they made ground in the book is astonishing. They went from these idyllic, they're coming down into the World's Fair, they're surrounded by all these amazing smells and sights and sounds and people, and now they're just descending into this hellscape. And the amount of time that has passed in the real world of the book is really not that much. And they're cursed with this agelessness in a way, or this inability to age past a certain point. They bear this responsibility that they're clearly too young to handle. So they've gone from this sort of optimistic, cheery, let's go on an adventure kind of gung-ho attitudes to where now they're just like browbeaten and burned out and just have no pleasure in life anymore. And then you get this whole scene with Miles and Ryder that in a way is when I was reading this, what kept coming to my mind, as weird as it is Obi-Wan and Luke in Star Wars. And that kind of like Obi-Wan is the writer of this situation. He's like this older, world-wise, weary, I've got experience. I know what's coming. I'm trying to explain this to you. And then Miles is just kind of like, yeah, okay, whatever. It's, it is what it is. Not really taking it as seriously as he should. You could also throw in the hologram part of it because that's kind of a big part of that as well. But yeah, there is a lot that's going on in this particular discussion, especially when Ryder says, you boys spend too much time up there. You lose sight of what's really going on in the world. You think you understand. They're, again, fictional characters, but they exist in the real world. They can't really manipulate the real world in a way that they think they can. And they don't really have, because of their age and their inability to age again, they never will. They won't. They can't have that perspective on the world, and to do that kind of diminishes their ability to almost to exist, because that knowledge in a way kind of corrupts their whole being. Like, I'm trying to think of like how to explain it, but like if you think about those kind of characters in those kind of novels, those dime adventure novels, right? They never really tackle major issues. It's always a Scooby-Doo in the sky kind of thing. So to have them faced with this grim reality of what's going on in the real world is almost inconceivable to them. And so they're trying to process all of this while they're having to experience it in real time. It's insane. I could go on and on and on about this chapter. And there's some great writing in here. But yeah, that's kind of like the distillation of my takeaway on this whole chapter and this whole scene.
In a way, it's almost like Thorne's like willingness to direct with Miles is something to do with the fact that he has at this point become kind of the crazy guy who people can't rely on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it is an interesting thing because Miles may be playing dumb in this conversation. We know he's not. We know he is much savvier than he lets on. And it's like the guy is treating it, and it's not like Miles is, some like what's the people I'm trying to think of. It's not like he's a KGB operative, right? It's not like he's just, at this point pre-OSS like hard case. He's just kind of a dude. He's not putting on airs. He's literally just kind of a guy pretending to be a little bit less able to put the dots together than he is. And it's like Thorne treats him as though he's like being waterboarded and refusing to give up information almost. And he's just like, fine, you win. You've reduced me to this. And it's entirely through just that like pure exhaustion that you talked about, Cody. It's a really fascinating section. And like I think you basically explained anything that I was going to explain as far as interpretation goes. But I don't know. There are so many little nuances to the conversation that I feel like if you're sufficiently motivated, you could probably get anything out of this conversation if you wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to summarize it. When Miles goes back to the ship, he is referred to as having experienced something called plasmic hysteresis. I sort of already mentioned this in the sense of the Stupendica, but hysteresis is two identical processes that arrive at a final destination by two different paths. And plasmic hysteresis might mean, it's an invented thing for Pynchon, might mean that there is a ambiguously reversible process allowing for the way in which the intruders show up to take on this sort of ethereal form, that they're able to move back and forward through a process it's unclear how, but it's not permanent one way or the other, whereas a sort of a standard hysteresis would not be fluid like that. As I understand it, that's entirely a theory, and it's based off of something that he invented. So there's no way of knowing for sure. But it's yeah, you can get so much out of this conversation, and I think it's also fairly accurate to say that it's on the page, that we can go over it line by line. But when it comes to his big themes in this book, Pynchon isn't sort of hiding the ball. I think no matter what degree of sort of research you've been doing to this point in the book, you're going to kind of pull something out of this back and forth that they have that is resonance to your experience in reading the book. Do we have anything else on 39 before we wrap up?
I mean, I could talk for a while about the whole ukulele thing and the four note chord and how that relates to the quaternion stuff. I don't think I can articulate it very well, but I think there's definitely a connection between those two. And the reason he chose a 4-note chord rather than a 3-note, which is typically the composition of chord. But other than that, yeah, I mean, I could go on and on about this. We could have done 2 separate episodes on these 2 chapters and really dove into them. But I'm happy with what we've kind of mined from it so far.
Yeah, I guess we should probably like talk about it, just because I think it is slightly obscure on the page. What exactly what are these visitors then? If it's phrased the way that it is, their perceptions of like their future beings who are just trying to make things happen almost.
I don't know so much that it's future beings as much as it is sort of a parallel universe kind of thing, that there's that cross connection, which would tie into the refraction and bilocation thing of that the whole book is kind of getting at, where there seems to be this kind of world in the background that's slightly distorted off of the one that we exist in, or at least that the characters in the book exist in. And this person or this group of people who writer represents have found a way to kind of cross that threshold in a way and make contact. And so that's his purpose, is to kind of be like, hey, I'm just letting you know from experience, like, we've gone through this and it doesn't end well. So, I don't know what to tell you as far as how to stop it, but you got to try to stop it. There's nothing good that's going to come of this. So I think that's ultimately kind of what it is that there's a sort of like a fracture between those two realities that has kind of shifted them off of each other just slightly enough that they're different in a significant way.
Okay, that makes sense to me.
That also makes sense to me. I don't think I could have articulated it that way because my head was real scrambled the first time they came up, and if you recall, I went on a very long rant about how maybe they're coming out of a television. That was a real conspiracy corner to top off that episode. So I appreciate you spelling it out that way because I think that makes a lot of sense to me.
It raises an interesting question, though, not one that we can answer, but just the fact that like we already have we have this almost accepted level of metaphysical fuckery in the form of the Chums of Chance.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have their own layer of it, which that we've been talking about that from the beginning. But for them to have their own layer of it, and for it to be similar to how the Chums are relative to our real timeline, seeming to be like just kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like just kind of superfluous figures, like agents for things that don't need agency. It's an odd device, even for Pynchon, because it makes you not even like, oh, it's a puzzle, or oh, it's a frustrating non-puzzle. It's just kind of like chewing gum almost for that kind of metafiction.
That's an interesting analogy. I don't disagree with it. I'm trying to think if there's anything I could add to that. I don't know that there is.
Right. So what are some funny moments that we missed, if there are any?
I would like to read Lindsay's retort to Randolph about his comment on 549 about how they've become more invisible when he says, yeah, I bet you I could I could even pull out my knockwurst here and wave it at him and nobody'd even notice, cackled Darby. Suckling, gasped Lindsay. Even taking into account considerations of dimension, which in your case would require a modification of any salation metaphor towards the diminutive, wiener being perhaps more appropriate. Nonetheless, the activity you anticipate is prohibited by statute in most of the jurisdictions over which we venture, including in many instances to the open sea, and can only be taken as symptomatic of an ever more criminally psychopathic disposition. Hey, Noseworth, replied Darby, it was big enough for you the other night. I always love the banter between those two and how it goes from it's really, I think, representative of Pynchon's highbrow, lowbrow comedy writing, just in a quick little back and forth.
Yeah, I'll just say that like pretty much everything is, even if he is a symbol for like grounding, literal and metaphorical sense. Pretty much everything he says is really funny to me. Like
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
going back through the previous chapter and it's just like, no, everything he says, I can't pick one of them. They're quite funny.
All right. Do we have a quote that we want to share?
I have one. Mine is on 555. I wish I were not here, cried Rider Thorn. I wish I had never seen these halls of night, that I were not cursed to return and return. You've been so easy to fool, most of you anyway. You're such simpletons at the fair, gawking at your wonders of science, expecting as your entitlement all the blessings of progress. It is your faith, your pathetic balloon boy faith. I mean that's kind of a summary of what I find kind of obnoxious and annoying about this period in history. Not that it's like a major, I don't like sit around seething about it, I guess, but just the general like kind of hopefulness of this era and the belief in progress and that progress is infinite and stuff, which does persist to this day. And that paragraph you could apply that to any number of people that put their faith and their money and all of that into supporting the billionaire class and things of that nature. I do think the end of that paragraph, it is your faith, your pathetic balloon boy faith, especially the word, I guess, because there's a dash between it, so it's portmanteau maybe. But the balloon boy, I just kind of, it's a little bit funny to me, pathetic balloon boy, and I feel like if you could, if a cartoon villain is saying it is your faith, your pathetic balloon boy faith, they and like cackling like a villain would, it would maybe put a smile on my face, but also it's just very melodramatic. That being said, I do understand what he's saying in the context of that time period and the context of 2006 when this book was published, and then still today. I feel like that paragraph is still pretty relevant.
That's a good pull. That was my contender, so I have to go with my backup, which is a little bit earlier on 551. Miles, looking out at the humid distances from this height, at the hesitant darkness in which little could be read across a lowland fixed anciently under a destiny, if not quite a curse, contemplated the pallid vastness of twilight and its suspense, its cryptic insinuation. What was about to emerge from the night just behind the curve of the earth? Fog from the canals rose toward the ship. A smudged and isolated copse of willows emerged for a moment. Low clouds in the distance bleared the sun, causing the light to break into suggestions of a city hidden behind what was visible here, sketched in shadows of top and damaged rows. Nothing so sacred or longingly sought as Shambhala, stained with a persistent component of black in all light that swept this lowland, flowing over dead cities, mirror still canals, black shadows, tempest and visitation, prophecy, madness. What a harrowing thing to see for Miles. I mean, it's kind of a coming of a portent. It's if things continue on this course, this is the shape of the world to come, and this is exactly what Ryder ends up warning him of. Beautiful writing, beautiful descriptive writing, really, really evocative, really, really powerful stuff.
It really illustrates like the burden of prophecy on a prophet.
Yeah.
In a way that the Bible is not even capable of.
Yeah, that's true.
My quote actually goes right before yours does, Cody.
Oh, yeah.
Since the mission to Inner Asia, Miles had been engaged ever more deeply with a project of the spirit which he found himself unable to share with the others in the crew, though it was plain to all that his present trajectory might take him perhaps further than he could find his way back from. Beneath the sands of the Taklamakan, while Chick and Darby had idled mindlessly at one Liberty port after the next, and Lindsay and Randolph had spent hours conferring with Captain Toadflax over how most effectively to carry on the search for Shambhala, Miles was being tormented by a prefiguration, almost insupportable in its clarity, of the holy city, separated by only a slice of time, a thin screen extending everywhere across his attention, which grew ever more frail and transparent. Unable to sleep or converse, he would often lose track of recipes, forget to stir the popover dough, wreck the sky coffee, while others continued calmly about the chores of the day. How could they not know of that immeasurable approach? Thus he sought out Pugnax, in whose eyes the light of understanding was a beacon in what had, without warning, become dangerous skies. Just piggybacking off of everything that you said, of course, about your quote, because they're very much linked together, those four paragraphs. But I think the other thing is that, like, we're talking a lot about the human cost of organizations on people, and I think that there is also a truth in that there seems to be something about the organization that the Chums of Chance work for that is responding to, or is partially responsible for, the direction that the world is headed in. That at the very least they're allied with those positions of power that are directing the world in the sort of track it's stuck on, and that the Chums are somehow sort of a servant of that, either in part or in whole, and that is having a human cost on them. That they do, especially after the Candlebrow episode, they do seem so much more human, older, haggard, tired, and that the sort of support of that great evil somewhere beyond the slice of time, that again, we're talking about these barriers like dissolving and breaking. those two paragraphs really emphasize the toll that's having on Miles. And the way that comes about in its final analysis is through the fact that, like, even the purpose he has on the ship, which back to the construction of them as storybook characters from very, very early on, is his whole thing. He does nothing else. That's if he is a Barbie, if he's a Ken doll, his ability is chef. And so he's losing even that in the face of the weariness and the prophecy that he's seeing and the world that is coming. And that's just a very sort of devastating way to put it. And again, just really an example of how I will never be as good of a writer as Pynchon is. It's hard for anyone to do this stuff, let alone for someone to do it as often as he does.
Will, who stole your quote this time?
Actually, no one stole my
Damn.
quote this time. I would like to. I'm gonna read the paragraphs introducing and following the Quaternion Year song, because the song is fun and all, but I think the way
We
it's
didn't talk about the
introduced-
song, but yeah, it wasn't a bad one.
Yeah, it's a novelty song, and it's framed as a novelty song. So personally, it's a lot easier for me to imagine people singing a novelty song than something that is
Yeah.
clearly absurd. But the actual just like introduction to it, I think, is beautiful. Accompanying these laments was some inappropriately chirpy music, which Kit had now come in earshot of. What appeared to be a music hall contralto in a species of poire gown sat at a piano, accompanied by a small street ensemble of accordion, glockenspiel, baritone, saxophone, and drums singing in a bouncy 6/8. Oh, the quizzical queer quaternia near, blah blah blah, which the captivated assembly had been tirelessly singing along with over and over since the chanteuse had come on shift, its time signature working some ancient tarantelical magic as well, producing among the company an irresistible desire to dance with wild abandon, whatever that meant around here. Collisions were frequent, often forceful, Kit being able to avoid one only by having recognized just before contact a familiar deep voice. They're sure enough. In a full barrel rolling conviviality was Root Tubsmith. Aside from my stumbling over it, the meter of those lines, collisions were frequent, often forceful. Kit being able to avoid one. It's a lot of dactyls in there. There's a lot of rhythm that would fit 6/8 quite well, which is just nice. And Pynchon loves, as all good authors should, if you ask me, loves his dactyls, and he uses them well in that paragraph and a half. So I think it's just lyrically beautiful.
So we have one email. Someone want to read that out?
I've got it right here. Yeah.
Are we doing most pension part?
Oh God,
shit.
yeah.
Thank you, Luke.
Yeah.
Jesus. What are we doing with ourselves?
What's the most Pynchon part of the chapter? It's the mayonnaise. But you're allowed to say something else, I guess.
Actually, I'll throw out the final conversation between Ryder and Miles. I think that the structure of that conversation, the themes that it's touching on, and the weight that it carries is very Pynchon. I think he's really, really good about having very deep thematic content expressed in conversation between two characters, but also mayonnaise.
Yes, similar in terms of reasons to Cody's choice there. I'm gonna go actually just before the quote I read out earlier. I'm gonna go with actually Quaternions failed because they perverted what the Vectorists thought they know of God's intention, that space be simple, three-dimensional, and real, and if there must be a fourth term and imaginary, that it be assigned to time. But Quaternions came in and turned all that end for end, finding the axes of space as imaginary and leaving time to be the real term, and a scalar as well, simply inadmissible. Of course, the Vectorists went to war. Nothing they knew of time allowed it to be that simple, any more than they could allow space to be compromised by impossible numbers, earthly space they had fought over uncounted generations to penetrate, to occupy, to defend. And that's just, it's far from the most artful example of it. But the fact that Pynchon throws so much at you that doesn't read as entirely ham-fisted. It is a pretty hallmark trait of his writing. So, yeah.
I think my most mentioned part is, which I don't think we talked about too much. Maybe we did. I'm just forgetting. But the Dr. Rao disappearing and then appearing in the kitchen is in a different body.
Oh yeah.
It's a very, I don't know. I really know very little to nothing about any possible, mathematics or whatever involved with teleportation and all of that. But I don't know. It's just, I find that kind of funny and quirky, like in the way that Pynchon can be. It can often be.
All right, Cody, you want to read the email?
Yeah. So we have the one email. It says, "Hello, Mapping the Zone team. My name is Nicholas Marsh, and I recently discovered your podcast a few weeks ago after I picked up Against the Day for the first time. I just wanted to reach out and share with you all how appreciative I am of your podcast. I only came to discover Pynchon about 5 years ago after watching Paul Thomas Anderson's Inherent Vice for the first time and absolutely loving it. Since then, I've completely rediscovered my love for reading that had unfortunately been left behind during my college years. And while I've loved working my way through Pynchon's work, along with many other literary fiction works, I've often found it a bit lonely at times because most of the people in my life who do read are typically reading more modern fantasy books rather than the type of books I like to read. Discovering your podcast and hearing the joy with which you all talk about Pynchon, and especially Against the Day, has brought a great happiness to my life. My wife frequently makes fun of me for how excited I get to listen to a 3+ hour podcast about 2 chapters of an 1,100-page book, but man, your podcast is outstanding. Try to make an effort as I'm getting older to be more aware of the things that bring me joy, and if it's a case of people, letting them know how appreciative I am. So I am reaching out to say thank you all so much for all you do putting out the podcast. I look forward to each episode that is released, and I'm excited to go back and reread the other books you've already covered, and dive into those episodes too. Best, Nicholas Marsh." Nicholas, I feel very seen by this whole email. I also got into Pynchon after I heard about PTA's Inherent Vice adaptation. I went and grabbed the book from the library near where I worked at the time, and just that kind of started my love affair with the man's work. And I've also it also kind of rekindled my love of reading challenging books as someone who I've been a lifelong reader, and I still love to read genre fiction, as has been discussed many times on the show. But Pynchon really got me back into reading like challenging, dense kind of stuff, and yeah, I mean, as far as your mention of being lonely at times because most of the people in your life who do read don't read this kind of stuff. That's why I started the whole show. I didn't have anyone else I could talk about this stuff with, and it was driving me crazy. And I've got really lucky to find these 3 fools who will talk for 3 hours and more about 2 chapters of an 1,100-page book. It's phenomenal. I love it. And I'm really glad that we can bring that kind of joy to you. And as someone who is, I'm in my 40s. I definitely have been making more of an effort to also kind of like really show appreciation for the things that I find bring joy to my life. So I thank you very much for that. And recording this episode reminds me of how much I really enjoy doing this. It's a ton of fun. I genuinely think if we didn't have the constraints of a listenable podcast, which we already are pushing the limits of, the 4 of us could probably talk for an entire day about these 2 chapters, about these books, about any books. And it's a really great pleasure to have the ability to do that. And so I would encourage you, find people who read and meet them on their level at first, talk the fantasy books and the genre fiction books, if you know them. Use that as a gateway to get them into Pynchon and other stuff, That's kind of what it was for me. As I read Pynchon, I found all these connections to that genre fiction that I really loved. And so when I talk to people about it and they're kind of like, I don't know, it's a 400-page book, it's a 500-page book. I'm like, yeah, but you like this, and there's a lot of this in there. So, just yeah, I mean, if nothing else, just keep reading and keep talking about books. It's great. I love it.
Yeah, I really just to pile on top of what Cody said. I really enjoyed this email. It's just nice to get positive feedback and to know that, people are enjoying what we're doing. All of us are in some way creative. And I mean, I have my own creative endeavors, and it's not, positive feedback is not, not everyone is out there handing out positive feedback all the time, especially not, ones that are well thought out and heartfelt like that email seemed to be or was. So I did really appreciate that email.
I don't want to talk over anything y'all have said. You want to mention though, we got a comment on YouTube for our last episode a couple days ago.
Oh, did we?
Yeah. I'll just read it out.
Yeah.
On YouTube, we got a comment from user Jaunty Jean. I don't know if you read these comments, but I recommend reading Very Nice Indeed, Cyprian Latewood's Masochistic Sublime and the Religious Pluralism Against the Day. It's available for free online. I remember reading it a few years ago, and it was very interesting. And yeah, I think especially since, it'll be a while before we're towards the end of the book, but once we do that, and for those of us who have already read the book, I look forward to digging into that article. I always enjoy a good scholarly analysis of an utterly perplexing character like Cyprian.
Mm-hmm. I wasn't aware of that. I'm gonna have to go searching for it now.
Yeah.
I just have to say, Cody, the way you said that was very Southern dialect inflected for some reason.
It definitely was, and it was like broad Southern.
That was crazy.
Not even like deep South, just like only a Southerner would have said that.
Oh man, Texas came out of me.
I think for the first time in our friendship, I just witnessed the Texas come out of you.
Yeah, and I'm not even in Texas anymore. It's crazy.
That's wild.
The vapor pressure is too low to keep it in.
Yeah.
All right, that does bring us to the end of our episode. If you'd like to get us into contact, oh boy, if you'd like to get into contact with us, you can do so in one of the following ways. Jesus, I'm apparently burning fumes. You can donate to us directly on Ko-Fi if you want to support the show. Any of the funds that you do send our way are going to be used to improve the show and help to pay our hosting costs primarily. There's been a lot of donations as of late. Thank you guys as always for listening to the podcast, whether it's the David Foster Wallace episodes we've been doing, the bonus episodes we've been doing, these episodes on our primary season, or yep.
Words.
I'm gonna go to bed now. Whether you've been listening to any of the things that we do or all of it, that was what I was gonna say, or all of it. Thank you for your listenership and for sending money our way as of late. It's been very, very appreciated. A lot goes into the production of the show, especially as our RSS feed grows larger and larger in a way that has more data because of how long our episodes are. And so that is one way you can support us. If you would like a piece of merchandise to go along with your financial support, you can achieve that with a shirt or a bag or a mug or stickers of some variety. I'm going to try and get something else designed to put up on there so that we have some new stuff in the store. Or Luke always has great designs that we can throw up there too. And then if you want to just get in contact with us like some of the others have done on this episode, you can comment on our YouTube, as one person did. We are there at Mapping the Zone. We're on Blue Sky at Mapping the Zone Podcast. We're on Twitter at PinchOnPod. You can email us at mappingthezonepodcast@gmail.com. And we are also on Instagram at Mapping the Zone. There are also a number of ways to engage with our work outside of this. Luke runs a literary magazine that's based on the internet called Just Keep Up. You can follow my occasional ramblings in Substack on my feed there at Fostering Kate. And Cody's been writing some stuff as of late. What's the outlet that you're writing for, Cody?
Inspite Magazine, another online magazine.
Yeah, so plenty of ways to keep in touch with us. If 4-hour episodes on, as our listener put it, 2 chapters of an 1,100-page book isn't enough of us for you. Next week, we will be discussing chapters 40 through 41. And Cody, do you have the last line that ends on for other pagination?
It is 587, right? Yeah. It was her first visit here with that hunter. What was she thinking? That Tancredi had better kiss her, and soon. Ooh.
Steamy.
Well, without further ado, thank you all for listening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See ya.